Coming up next, The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy. Every Thursday from 4 p.m, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
People are struggling to have conversations and connect with others that they don't completely agree with on every topic. And I think that's probably the biggest problem that we need to try and solve, is how after all this division and after all this separation do we end up bringing people together again, and what does unity really look like?
New Zealand faces some pretty big issues. First one is COVID and the aftermath. There's no getting away from that. Second is racial division. It's been ginned up and it's dangerous. Another issue that maybe people haven't got their head around yet is digital currency. What form does that take? Is it programmable? Will it be used to manipulate behaviour and patterns of behaviour? Those questions need to be asked and answered.
How can you have fair, open, democratic government by people who are appointed? It's a ridiculous idea. And if that idea is taken to its zenith, then this country is in real trouble, because democracy, one person, one vote, where every vote is of equal value, has got to be the foundation of a modern New Zealand.
What's true, what's not true, how our kids are to be educated. And, I have a great fear for the future. I think we know from history where this could end up.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.
Welcome to The Crunch on Reality Check Radio. I'm your host, Cam Slater, and this is the place we crunch the political issues and cut through the politician's spin. This week's the first show of the year, and we kick off in the week of Waitangi Day. And I thought I'd kick off the year seeing what Don Brash has to say about the annual shenanigans at Waitangi, and his thoughts on how we actually can have the necessary discourse needed to debate the so-called principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And then I'll chat with Ashley Church about the current conflict in the Middle East. Listeners have been wondering why I've been silent on this topic. Well, we had an election to cover first. Now some of the emotion and heat has gone out of the topic, we can have a more sensible discussion. Of course, we have the first mailbag of the year, and we'll close out the show with Cam's Buddies, and we have a little surprise in store for you there. So hang in to the end of the show to hear it. Don't forget to send comments to inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057. Welcome back to The Crunch for 2024. Here at RCR, we strive to bring you thought-provoking discussions on the issues that matter. Today, just after Waitangi Day, I want to address a concerning matter that has been unfolding at the annual Waitangi celebrations. A celebration that should be a time of unity and reflection for all New Zealanders. It's disheartening to acknowledge yet again that a small group of individuals within the Maori community have chosen to engage in disrespectful behaviour during this significant event. Most notable was the shouting down of Winston Peters and David Seymour, along with the disrespectful nature of the treatment toward Nicole McKee at the hands of a small but vocal minority. The Waitangi Day celebrations hold immense cultural and historical importance, symbolising the partnership between Maori and Pākehā and providing an opportunity for dialogue and understanding. However, the actions of this small group cast a shadow over the otherwise meaningful and positive aspects of Waitangi Day. It's essential to emphasise that the actions of a few do not represent the sentiments of the broader Maori community or New Zealand as a whole. And while the specifics of their actions may vary, it is crucial to address this issue with a balanced perspective. Let's not let the actions of a minority distract us from the genuine efforts being made to foster unity and understanding. The vast majority of Maori and non-Maori alike come together during Waitangi Day to celebrate our shared heritage and build bridges for a harmonious future. But the legacy media are part of the problem, with a great many of their reporters talking up the hope of some sort of violent confrontation at Waitangi, a bit of biffo, so to speak. Their reporting of events was also coloured by the actions of the few boisterous protesters and individuals who were rude, overbearing, and in some cases, outright racist. And I'm looking at you, Hone Harawira and Kelvin Davis. What is important is to encourage open dialogue within the community to understand the concerns that may be driving such behaviour. We should seek solutions that promote respect, inclusivity, and appreciation for the diverse perspectives that make up New Zealand's cultural tapestry. As we reflect on the events surrounding Waitangi Day, let us not lose sight of the progress that has been made and the positive contributions of the broader Maori community. Together, let's strive for a future where Waitangi Day truly reflects the spirit of partnership, respect, and unity that it was intended to embody. And for that reason, we really need to have a proper debate by all of us about precisely what the so-called principles of the treaty actually are, given that no such principles are actually in the Treaty of Waitangi. If we are shouted down, demonised and ridiculed for simply wanting clarity, then the future of this country is in peril. We must always talk, debate and discuss challenging ideas, even if we disagree with them. Thanks for joining us on this important discussion here at Reality Check Radio, and we encourage our listeners to share their thoughts on this matter and continue the conversation within our community.
Our text machine is now live. Send us your thoughts by texting your message to 2057. That's 2057. So get in touch with us now.
We've had Don Brash on The Crunch before. Back then we talked about the boring topic of GST. This week, though, we're going to talk about the Treaty of Waitangi and the so-called principles of the treaty and the debate that David Seymour is trying to have about defining what those principles actually are. He joins me now. Good afternoon and welcome to the first Crunch show of the year, and welcome back to the show, Don Brash.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.
So we saw on Tuesday the usual charade and protest and carry on from Maori about Waitangi Day and a huge amount of misinformation being promulgated about what David Seymour and ACT's policy is to cement or at least put into some legislation what the principles supposedly are of the treaty. What are your thoughts on that, Don?
Well, I think he's got something which is well worthwhile pursuing. What he's really saying is that there's a lot of confusion about what the treaty meant, in the minds of some people at least. And this invention of principles of the treaty, which goes back to about 1975, when the Act was passed at that time, and has been embellished on and on over the years since that time, to the point where there are some people who already believe that Maori New Zealanders can form some kind of separate state within a state. I mean, it is almost as ridiculous as that. People contend that Maori chiefs did not cede sovereignty. There was no intention that they be subject to British rule, and therefore they should not be subject to the rule of the New Zealand Parliament now. And as I say, that is patently absurd. And most Maori, of course, don't believe that for a moment. When you say Maori New Zealanders made the trouble yesterday, of course, a great many Maori New Zealanders don't want a bar of what those guys are saying. And it's evidenced by the fact that three of the leading lights from Parliament there, of course, were David Seymour, Winston Peters, and Shane Jones, all of whom are not only Maori, but are Ngāpuhi. So it's not true that all Maori think that way, fortunately.
No, that's right. But this treaty principles idea, which you said came into being when the Waitangi Tribunal was formed, let's just go over this with the listeners, because there are no principles in the treaty.
That's
There's three articles of the treaty which are fairly clear in what they say, both in English and in Maori.
Yep.
And there are no principles, and it's a legal construct that activist judges have been extending via the Waitangi Tribunal and subsequent court cases in the High Court, the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, without anybody actually consulting us as to what these principles are.
Yeah.
And David Seymour's not wanting to change the treaty. This is the lie that is being put out by Te Pāti Maori. Numerous other politicians from the left are saying that David Seymour's trying to rewrite the treaty. He's not trying to rewrite the treaty, is he? He's trying to establish what these principles are so that we can move forward without this moving feast.
Well, that's absolutely right. As you say, the treaty itself is extremely simple, and it's been embellished again and again over the years to the point where it's come to mean something doesn't mean at all. And David really is saying, let's go back to what the treaty actually said and clarify what it means for New Zealand right now. And I'm absolutely with him on that. I think there needs to be that. And I'm hoping that the Prime Minister will not suggest he's going to oppose that beyond Select Committee. He said he will let David Seymour's bill go to the Select Committee for discussion and debate. He's not committed to supporting it beyond that, but I'm hoping that he will find there's a huge amount of public support for that bill and that he will eventually support it.
Yeah, there's a lot of weasel words from Christopher Luxon around this. I mean, he keeps saying, we're not going to support this bill past the first reading. And you have to sort of scratch your head. And if you know a little bit about parliamentary process, you wonder why we're actually going through this charade if National has no intention of supporting it afterwards. But I think it's important that we actually have this discussion. And that's the problem that I have with the various rowdies that are trying to shut down this debate, is they don't want to have a discussion about this. They want to promulgate and extend the fiction that Maori never ceded sovereignty. Yet Article 1 of the treaty actually cedes sovereignty, which allows Maori to become British subjects. Now, you can't become a British subject if you haven't ceded sovereignty, can you?
That's right. Not only the first article, but the preamble to the treaty also talks about ceding sovereignty to the Queen. So, I mean, I think even if they had, by chance, not ceded sovereignty at that point, the chiefs who met 20 years later at Kohimaramara clearly were talking about the Queen as their head of state, if you like, so that they were under no illusion at all that they had ceded sovereignty. And of course, in the decades since, most Maori leaders have been quite explicit about having ceded sovereignty. The most notable, I guess, of those was Sir Aparana Ngata. He was quite unambiguous that the Maori chiefs had ceded sovereignty at that point. And of course, if they hadn't, they make a nonsense of the last 180-something years. They've been employed by the state, they've paid taxes to the state, they've received benefits from the state as ordinary New Zealanders.
Well, of course, prior to the Kohimarama conference, for want of a better term, there's the 1852 Constitution Act as well, where we all became New Zealand citizens in a democracy.
That's right.
Yep. So it's a nonsense to, for Hone Harawira and Rawiri Waititi and Debbie Packer to suggest that sovereignty was never ceded. You can say it all you like, but it doesn't make it true now as it didn't make it true back then.
That's right. Exactly true.
I get sickened every Waitangi Day by this carry-on. And I have to blame most of the media for this, because it's like they're egging it on, promulgating these lies that David Seymour is seeking to rewrite the treaty and reporting it in such a way that it looks like everybody who was at Waitangi was against the government. But that's not the case from reports that I've had from on the ground at Waitangi, that there was actually a great amount of spirit of goodwill. It was only a small percentage of the people who were at Waitangi that, tried to overtalk David Seymour and Winston Peters and Casey Costello in the most rude and effrontery manner. But the media pushed these people to the front of everything and reported as if everyone was like that.
Yeah, they certainly give a quite distorted impression, which we both deeply resent. I mean, it's a major source of difficulty for New Zealand, I think, because the media have created the impression that Maori, which means in their terminology, the vast majority of Maori, are opposed to what David Seymour's bill proposes to do. And I suspect that's not true at all.
There's also a disconnect too in the media when they say, oh, look, there's 1,000 people that went to Turanga Waiwai at the behest of the Maori king. We'll get to talk about the Maori king a little bit later. But they said 1,000 people there, and this is a statement of force that we should all listen to as New Zealanders.
Well, I think, let me interrupt briefly. I think they said 10,000 people were there.
Well, okay, even 10,000.
Yeah.
And they say that. But, of course, 10,000 people rocked up to Parliament and camped on the forecourt there. And, of course, these were riffraff scumbags, people trying to protest, and we should be ignoring them and make them go away. So on one hand, they listen to the groups of people that they agree with and deride and demonize the groups that they don't like.
Yep.
That's not the role of the media, in my view. The role of the media is to report what happens.
And of course, the irony is this media we talk about is mainly state-owned. I mean, Television New Zealand and Radio New Zealand, RNZ, both paid by the taxpayers, funded by the taxpayers, and yet as they which are serious offenders in this area.
Well, it's not just them. I mean, the others might be private companies like NZME, the Herald, which includes the Herald and News Talk ZB, MediaWorks. All of these mainstream media companies availed themselves of multi-millions of dollars from the Public Interest Journalism Fund, and that required them to agree with the government of the day's contention that the treaty was a partnership and Maori were equal partners with the Crown, and they never ceded sovereignty as part of that. And they also had to adhere to the unwritten amorphous principles of the treaty as part of their requirements for reporting and getting funding from that.
Yeah, that's right.
And to cap that off, every single one of those mainstream companies is also in receipt of probably hundreds of millions of dollars of advertising from government departments, organisations like the police, New Zealand Defence Force, Ministry of Health, etc.
Yep, that's
right. So
it
could be argued that the state actually controls the media in New Zealand through its advertising budgets.
Certainly has an influence on it, no question about that.
What about the split that appears in academia? The media always run off to Margaret Mutu for comment. Elizabeth Rata has a completely different take on everything. In fact, she recently gave an interview here with Rodney Hyde. She outlined that the treaty was completely superseded by the 1852 Constitution Act. In Article 1 of the treaty, the Maori chiefs ceded sovereignty 100%. And as you said in the preamble, it says that too. And she notes that the principles do not go back to the 1840 treaty, that they're an invention from the 1980s. So we've got a 5-year difference there, 75 to 80s. That's probably about right. And Te Pāti Maori is now talking about having a separate Maori parliament.
Yeah, they're nuts, absolutely nuts.
Presumably we'll be funding that too.
Well, I mean, that's the question. How are they going to fund this? I mean, if they have a separate Maori parliament and a separate Maori government structure, then presumably they organise the funding of that themselves. At what point did someone classify as Maori and what point did they not? I have a friend who has one Maori great-great-great-grandfather and 31 great-great-great-grandparents who were not Maori. He's technically entitled to call himself Maori and go on the Maori roll. But I mean, it's a complete nonsense. He's 32th or 32nd Maori. The rest of his ancestry is European. Is he Maori or is he not Maori? I mean, it's a complete nonsense. Is he New Zealander?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? That we're all New Zealanders. I mean, Fiji went through this sort of debate after the Bainimarama coup, where he said that everybody who was born in Fiji is a Fijian.
That's right.
We're not going to have a separation of I Taukai and Kaivalangi, which means foreigners. If you're born in Fiji, you're a Kaiviti. That actually is a definition that applies to me. I was born in Fiji. I'm a Kaiviti. Sadly, though, with the Rambuka government, it looks like they're going back to the separatist idea where I Taukai have more rights than everybody else.
Yeah, now Fiji is a sad case, as you say. Bainimarama seems to be breaking away from that kind of nonsense, and I didn't know Fiji was drifting back towards the racially based citizenship. But it's tragedy if it's happening. Mm.
No, that's the thing. It is happening because one of the assistant directors of public prosecution, who was actually prosecuting Bainimarama and Aikeum, has been dismissed by the acting director of public prosecutions for the high crime of being white. And there's a massive court case in Fiji at the moment that's about to get underway about that in particular employment issue, where the acting director of public prosecutions, who arguably is in the position illegally because that position is appointed by the president in accordance with the Constitution, and that never happened. So you've got this nonsense that's happening, but everywhere in the world where we had separatism, this idea you can have separate this and separate that. I mean, we all protested against apartheid, yet we have Maori here, some Maori here, seeming to be desperately wanting to have apartheid as long as it's in their favour.
Yeah, no, it's an irony, a tragic irony. We're keen to go backwards in New Zealand.
I just want to touch on the Kingitanga movement. I find it hugely ironic that the media and Tainui themselves are pushing this idea that there is a Maori king. And the history of the Kingitanga movement, of course, is very interesting. It never existed before the treaty. It came into being after the treaty. Right. There never was a Maori king. We had a tribal society where they were all at each other's throats, which is one of the main reasons why all the chiefs signed the treaties. They wanted some law and order in New Zealand to stop the raiding and the marauding and everything else that was going on. And Tainui decided to form the Kingitanga movement because they thought if it was okay for the British to have a king or a queen at that time, then they should too. And so we've got this anti-colonialist attitude coming out of the rowdies in Maoridom, and also an anti-colonialist attitude coming from the truck driver from Huntly, who is called by the media the Maori king, when in actual fact they've got their own colonial construct to echo what was happening in Great Britain at the time.
It's certainly ironic, isn't it? Absolutely. One of the interesting things that I did in my past career when I was governor of the Reserve Bank was choose people to be on banknotes. We had previously all the banknotes had the Queen on, and we decided to put New Zealanders on. And we had 5 banknotes. The Queen is on one of them, and New Zealanders on the other 4. And I felt there should be one male Pākehā, one female Pākehā, one Maori of either gender, and one sports person. And everyone had to be dead. I won't go into the exception we made for Hillary. But I thought that choosing a Maori to go on the banknote would be enormously difficult. King movement, anti-king movement, different tribal groups, etc. But in fact, there was no pushback at all when we decided to put Aparanata on the $50 banknote. There was no objection of any kind, that at least none that have reached me. There may have been some people feeling grumpy, but none expressed that grumpiness to me. And that was one of the challenges. Do you choose a king movement Maori to go on the note or a non-king movement Maori to go on the note? And we chose, of course, Ngāta is from Ngāti Porou.
And not part of the Kingitanga movement.
That's correct.
And neither in Ngāpui or Ngāi Tahu or many other iwi around the country aren't part of the Kingitanga movement.
Well, that's right.
But I think there's a push now to try and have this united Maori voice, and I'm not sure that's working. Certainly Shane Jones said as much when he declined to go to Turanga Waiwai. I think he stated that he's not my king. I'm from Ngāpui.
Yeah. And of course, there was that enormous stoush between Ngāti Whātua and Tainui in Auckland not so long ago. I can't recall what that was. It was something to do with
it was out by the airport, wasn't it? Wasn't it to do with Itumatau?
I can't quite recall, but there was certainly quite a tension there at that point, not so long ago.
I was also laughing a little bit to myself at the hikoi that launched from Cape Reinga and arrived at the treaty grounds. And they had, the Herald actually says the hikoi in defence of Te Tiriti o Waitangi has arrived at its final stop in the Waitangi treaty grounds to its own chant of 2468, this government is out the gate. And I kind of laughed because it reminded me of an old British pop song that sort of went 2468 like that. And then I'm sitting there thinking, well, why the hell didn't they, make it a Maori chant? Why didn't they make it like something like Tahi Rua Toru Wha, this government is off the par? I mean, it's not hard to do, is it?
Yeah, that's right.
But we've got this, I always liken it to the union movement. They've got these stock standard chants that they like to use. And many of the people that are organising these marches and that are all from the union movement or all that side of politics. But, it's, again, the Herald is misreporting. They're saying in defence of the treaty, there's no party in this parliament or indeed any parliament who's ever said we're going to change the treaty. And yet the media reports that that's what David Seymour and the ACT Party want to do.
And of course, as we both agree, what he's trying to do is interpret what the treaty means today. And I think that's an eminently sensible thing to do. I hope that thing does go to referendum and that if it does, it's overwhelmingly passed. If perchance the National Party does kill the referendum, which obviously is a possibility at this stage, I think there's a very strong prospect of a citizens-initiated referendum. Now, of course, that's not ideal because those are not binding on the country, but they would certainly indicate very strongly where most people in New Zealand are. Public opinion polls suggest already that the great majority of New Zealanders want the referendum and support the principles that they were summarising what the treaty means.
In terms of the political play that's out there, I'm sitting here thinking David Seymour and Winston Peters and Shane Jones are rather cunning, and Christopher Luxon seems to be a little dull in the political ramifications of his stance. If he appears and continues to appear to be prevaricating or sitting on the fence, then the ACT Party and New Zealand First are going to profit from that in ways that Christopher Luxon won't like and possibly will undermine his leadership. Is that your view as well?
Not sure. I mean, I suspect at the moment he's playing a fairly shrewd game. He's saying we'll support this to the Select Committee, but we're not committed to going beyond that. And that leaves him the option of supporting it if public opinion is clearly in favour of it, as I suspect will be the case. So he's left his options open, but you're right that to the extent that he leaves doubt about whether he might support it, it does play to the advantage of both ACT and New Zealand First, particularly ACT, because New Zealand First is a bit ambivalent on the referendum. They're quite unambiguous about what kind of country we want, a sort of equal citizenship and removing references to the principle of the treaty, etc., from legislation. But for some reason I don't fully understand, they haven't come out strongly in favour of the referendum itself.
I think it's because Christopher Luxon before the election was very closely advised by Chris Bishop and by Nicola Willis, who are both wetter than an otter's pocket when it comes to these sorts of things. And I think Christopher Luxon is as wet as an otter's pocket as well on these issues. But again, it's kind of cunning on Christopher Luxon's point of view, because if he raises his head and says anything, then the media, the baying hounds in the media and the various racist parties that are out there pushing this separatist agenda will just call him a racist. It's very hard to call Winston Peters, David Seymour, Shane Jones, Casey Costello racists when they're all Maori.
Yep. That's right. And of course, as you well know, 7 of the 20 cabinet ministers are Maori.
Mm.
I think there's been any cabinet.
The highest level of Maori representation in cabinet ever.
I think that's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Higher even than, the Labour Party who say that they're the party for Maori, despite losing nearly all the seats at the last election. But again, you've got claims that winning all the Maori seats gives the Maori Party a mandate for all of Maoridom. And that's not the case, though, is it? I mean, it's a very small percentage voted in favour of Te Pāti Maori. On the party vote.
2.6%, I think, wasn't it? The show?
I think it was just a shade over 3, but certainly half of what New Zealand First got. And I was laughing like hell when another academic came out and said that neither the ACT Party nor the New Zealand First Party have a mandate to make these changes, but was singing the praises of Te Pāti Maori, which had a much lesser percentage of the vote.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And of course, not all Maori are on the Maori roll. It's a smaller number than the actual number of Maori in New Zealand.
I think only about half Maori are on the Maori roll from memory. It's around about 50%.
Yeah, so Te Pāti Maori is representing around 50% of Maori theoretically, but even then the percentages are small.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's not the same Maori Party or Te Pāti Maori anymore, is it? When Peter Sharples was there in Tariana-Turia, I had enormous respect for the Maori Party, as it was called then. I had enormous respect for the mana of both them, particularly Tariana-Turia, because she, on principle, left the Labour Party and did the honourable thing and forced a by-election.
Yeah.
And won.
Yeah.
There's not many politicians who do that. Where they leave a party and then force a by-election and then win. The only other person I can think of that's successfully done that was Winston Peters.
That's correct. But by chance, I called on Tariana-Turia in her home on Friday because, like you, I have a high regard for her. Back in 2005, you recall, she and Peter Sharples both talked about a coalition government with National when I was leader. And it was quite clear they would have preferred National to be in government than Labour. Actually, I discovered that the National Party candidate in that electorate around Whanganui, the Maori electorate, is Tariana's niece.
Right.
Yeah. So no, she's a person of real principle, in my view. Don't always agree with her, of course, but she's got real integrity.
Well, that's the benefits of living in a democracy, isn't it? That we can have differences of opinion, that we can discuss things even though we might not agree. And that's, again, the fault of the media, I see. They've demonized you as being a racist, organizing this, they smear Hobson's Pledge, refuse to actually engage with you in most of the media and demonize you and the organization. Even when it was headed up by Casey Costello, who is a Maori. Yeah. They still continue to do that to this day, and they're pushing their own agenda. And I'm not sure that New Zealanders are buying it. It's almost like the media, the Labour Party, Te Pāti Maori and the Green Party have forgot we had an election in October last year and that they lost.
They did, and lost big time.
Well, it was a huge sea change. But it's like there's a rearguard action being fought, and you've got simpering weaklings like John Campbell, who is basically a propagandist, but he's the chief correspondent for TVNZ.
I think that's actually an outrageous situation, which the government really shouldn't tolerate. He's promoting a vigorously anti-government agenda, and you think the taxpayer media should at least be neutral. And he doesn't even pretend to be neutral.
Well, there's no pretense at all, is there? He is outright hostile to the democratically elected government of New Zealand and has the arrogance to suggest that Kiwis were stupid and got it wrong.
Yeah, that's right. Indeed. It's an appalling case, actually. He should be gone by lunchtime.
It's hilarious because, I mean, I used to say this in the dark days of the Ardern regime when people were saying, if we don't get rid of her now, we'll never get rid of her. And I always used to say, well, no, in New Zealand, we have things called elections. And we invariably get rid of ratbag politicians. We got rid of Muldoon, and he was clearly almost a dictator towards the end. But we had an election, and that was the end of him. We got rid of Helen Clark the same way. We got rid of Jim Bolger and Jenny Shipley the same way through elections.
Yeah.
When governments take diabolical liberties with our country, we toss them out of power.
Yeah.
And yet we've got, I mean, I used to shudder at people on the centre right that would say that, Ardern's not my prime minister, or that she was selected. And it's a construct that's, well, frankly, bullshit.
Yeah.
We might not like the government. We can campaign against the government. That's all fine. But to deny that they're our prime minister or they've been selected, not elected, is just, it's silliness. And it's the same level of silliness that we're seeing in this debate around the treaty, where things simply aren't true, but are being taken as being true. And again, I blame the media because they're pushing this agenda as well, that David Seymour's going to change the treaty. He has no intention of changing the treaty.
Yeah, that's right. You mentioned the fact that we have a democracy and that we can change government. I've never forgotten in 2002 when I was a candidate for the National Party, but not at that point in Parliament. I was a list MP because I was asked to join the National Party very close to the election, in fact, and I'd been governor of the Reserve Bank. And I recall vividly going to a black tie dinner in Napier on the night before the election in 2002. And the host of the dinner asked the local vicar to give thanks for the food we were about to eat. And he got up and he gave thanks for the food and the drink. And he said, let's give thanks for the fact that in 24 hours' time, we will have elected a new parliament and nobody will have been shot. Nobody beaten to death, and the army will be in its barracks. We're one of a tiny number of countries where we can say that with absolute confidence. And we can still say that with confidence. I mean, Hipkins may have detested the outcome of the election, but there was no suggestion he would cut out the army.
Well, it would be laughable if he did.
Well, that's right.
There's more citizens with firearms than there are the military. In fact, members of my antique arms club, if we bounded together, would probably have more firearms and firepower than the New Zealand Army. That's the sad state that our military has become. And it's actually good in that respect, in that you can't get a dictatorish politician wanting to use the army because New Zealand's simply too big and the army's too small. Fiji's a different matter. I mean, you basically just surround Suva and it's all over. And you can do that with a couple of battalions, less than that even. But we haven't even got a full battalion that can be mustered of infantry in the New Zealand Army.
That's right.
It's been debased, sadly, by multiple governments over decades. Have run it down. Yeah, they've got some new toys here and there, but successive governments have not valued the necessity of a reasonably sized military. And the world considers 2% of GDP to be spent on GDP as a bare minimum. We're well under that and have been for decades. So, in that respect, that means there can't really be a coup. There aren't even enough police to be able to do that. If the citizens under the lockdowns had decided that they were going to completely ignore it, there's nothing the police nor the army would have been able to do about it.
True.
So what do we have to do as a nation moving forward, Don? I'm of the mind that we should have the debate. We should always have the debate. Do you think we're going to be allowed to have the debate?
Well, I think we will have the debate, whether we're allowed to, quote, or not allowed to. People want the debate. It's interesting the amount of support which Hobson's Pledge has got over the last year or so. It's increased very substantially. And that's not because we've had any funds from offshore. We haven't had a dime from offshore. People want change from the sort of Ardern regime, and they want this current government to fix the issue. which is why I think that Seymour's got a very good prospect of getting his referendum, one way or the other.
Well, a midterm referendum would be a very good bellwether of the support of the government, wouldn't it?
Certainly would.
That's probably why Labor, Te Pāti Māori and the Greens are opposing it.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether Seymour is actually proposing a midterm referendum or a referendum at the next election. I'm not quite sure where he is on that point.
Well, if I was him, I'd be pushing a midterm referendum.
Yeah, okay.
Keeps the debate alive, and it sets it up for the following year to have to go into the election saying, well, we'll put all of that at risk if you vote us out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, if you've actually got a stake in the ground, a referendum result that shows, 60% or 65%, something like that, or might even be higher, supporting a bill to define what the treaty principles are so that the courts can no longer just make them up as they go along.
Yep.
That's a huge stake in the ground that you can have going into the following election after that referendum, saying these guys want to overturn that. These guys want to make that go away. You need to vote for us. And I'm pretty sure that New Zealand First will get on board that eventually. It makes sense. I mean, I can see what their political agenda is for the next 3 years, and that's, walloping these rowdy Maori, walloping banks, walloping fuel companies and supermarkets. That's profit all day long for New Zealand First, and it's their wheelhouse. ACT can do what they're doing and grow their support, and National's going to be squeezed between the two by the looks of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. National's been around a long time, and they came back from the dead in 2005, for example, and it came back from the dead in 2023. I mean, they got very bad results in 2002 and 2020, but nevertheless recovered.
The Labor does that too. They had a very bad result under David Cunliffe, and then came back from that.
That's right. So I think the two major parties are deeply entrenched in New Zealand society somehow.
Yeah, it's sad, really, even though you used to be a leader of the National Party.
Yes, I did indeed.
Well, I've always analysed the National Party as the party of the status quo. They're not great change agents. The slight exception would be the first term of the Bolger years, where they passed the Employment Contracts Act, and they did a couple of other significant things, particularly around the requirement for governments to report their financial position, even though every government since then has taken diabolical liberties with that law. But they're generally not change agents. They like to manage the status quo, and the party operates the same way, where straight after an election, if Nationals won, they don't want to change anybody on the board because they just won an election. The year after that, it's the kind of midterm ones, and then they'll usually come up with an excuse to make any changes there, and then they roll into an election year and the party says, oh, no, we don't want to make any changes to the board. It would send a bad signal to the electorate. And so they end up with board members who have been there 15, 20, 25 years and not refreshing and not changing.
Yeah. In one sense, I'm less concerned about the board of the National Party. I'm more concerned about the fact that too often the National becomes government that doesn't change the things that need to be changed. And I think the best example of that was 2008. I mean, National won big in 2008, and the things that they promised to change and change in a major way basically stayed on.
Well, I mean, that's a good point, exactly, because John Key campaigned in the 2008 election on the basis that working for families was communism by stealth. He even said that in the parliament.
That's right.
Yet very early on in his first term, he didn't do what he promised to do and get rid of working for families. In fact, he extended working for families and made it more communism, but it wasn't by stealth anymore. It was right there in front of us. And
he also campaigned in 2008 on getting rid of Maori electorates.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen either. In fact, it's no longer talked about.
Well, speaking of that, it's hilariously funny because the Never Winston crowd inside the National Party always hold up the fact that Winston Peters wanted to get rid of the Maori electorates. And they say he's never done it, another broken promise. But they never look at their own party and John Key's broken promise to get rid of the Maori electorates as well.
Yeah. But
I can remember having a discussion about those Maori electorates over several years with MPs. One was Tony Ryle, of course, no longer an MP now. And he said to me when I suggested we get rid of the Maori electorates, he said, oh, God, no, we can't do that. And I said, why is that, Tony? He says, well, I'd lose my electorate. I said, oh, okay, so self-interest. And he goes, oh, well, it's not like that, Cam. And I said, yeah, Tony, it is, right? The principle is that we're all the same in New Zealand. Instead of having these separate Maori electorates, which basically have gifted Labour for many, many decades, a 4 or 5 or 6 seat lead over the National Party. And but no one in National, in particular, Tony Ryle and the MP for Rotorua at the time were implacably opposed to getting rid of the Maori seats because it would seriously affect their chances of re-election.
Deeply depressing. Funny enough, the first person that I heard leader of the National Party promised to get rid of Maori electorates was Bill English. Bill English promised when he was leader way back in 2003. I heard him make the promise at the Lower North Island Regional Conference of the National Party. The next national government will get rid of Maori electorates. I made the same promise in 2005, but of course I didn't become Prime Minister. I couldn't do it. Didn't form a government. And John Key made the promise in 2008 and did form a government, but didn't do it either.
With Bill English as his deputy.
That's right. Exactly.
And never did it, and here we are today.
Yep.
Now with more Maori seats than there were back then.
The irony is, a couple of years back, when Simon Bridges was leader of the National Party, recall the leader and deputy leader of National, the deputy leader of Labour, the leader and deputy leader of New Zealand First, the co-leader of the Greens, and the leader of the ACT Party were all Maori, and the only one who got into Parliament with a Maori electorate was the deputy leader of Labour, named Kelvin Davis.
Yeah.
All the rest got in there either in general electorates, as Simon Bridges, for example, did in Tauranga, where I am, or on the list.
Well, speaking of Kelvin Davis, what did you make of his statement that there was that were Pākehā spiders?
Oh, I mean, despicable statement. Despicable statement.
I mean, if he'd said cockroaches, what would have been the outcry? But there was no outcry at all, and the media reported this widely. We didn't hear anything from the Human Rights Commissioner. I mean, it's appalling racism.
Human Rights Commission has become a total nonsense. They put out a document just the other day, or a few weeks ago. Anyway, I can't pronounce the Maori name for it, which was very, very shoddy piece of work, which Paul Moon has absolutely demolished. Yeah, not good.
Well, Paul Hunt's going to be gone. He should be gone by now, I think. I'm not sure when his term extends, but he was told very quickly, your term's not going to be renewed, pal. See you later.
Right. Well, I'd go along with David Seymour's view, I think, is that we should scrap the commission completely. It's become a hotbed of left nonsense.
Well, that's the problem with all of these organizations, isn't it? They start off with fine intentions, and then the system, infested with woke newspeak and right think, starts working away and empire building, and all of a sudden you've got this massive problem in 10 years, 20 years' time.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if we've solved any problems here, Don, but we've certainly brought them to the fore. I'm with you. I think that we should have the debate. I think it should be a robust debate, and it should be conducted not just in the Parliament, but using the parliamentary processes with select committee submissions, etc. I think there should also be almost a travelling roadshow about what is the intentions of this bill. And I think that the government needs to sidestep the mainstream media and start speaking directly to people using social media in order to get the message out there that it's not what is being claimed. And we need to define these things because activist judges are defining these things on the fly, and they keep on expanding and expanding and expanding what those principles mean.
Yeah, completely agree with you.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. It's the first show of the year, and we look forward to talking to you again throughout the year.
Very good. Thanks, Cam.
Thanks, Don. Thank you. Don Brash is such a gentleman. He always speaks highly of others. I agree with Don about the need for a proper debate on the treaty principles, and we should all encourage this debate. Tell me your thoughts on what Don Brash had to say by emailing inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057. All right, a little treat for listeners. We're going to have a new show starting next week, a summer series. And with me now is the host of that show, Dewa de Boer.
Hello, Cam. Thank you for having me on the show. It's great to be here.
Well, I thought we'd do a little promo. You write for us at the BFD, and you've got your own website, rightminds.nz, although that's in hiatus at the moment. But you've had a few podcasts and things like that. What's the thrust of your show going to be about?
The focus of the show that we're doing will be on New Zealand culture, some history from around the Anglosphere, classics from Rome, England, and Greece, and hopefully focusing on the current events of other nationalist movements around the world, so how people in other countries are fighting the globalists. A lot of other groups out there who, in these other countries, who have their own challenges, some of which are the same as ours, but in each country is having to grapple with unique issues to fight back against the globalists, and we're hoping to bring some of those perspectives to our New Zealand audience.
Well, it'd be interesting if you can get someone from Argentina to talk about the new president, because he's certainly been upending the globalists in their own space as well.
Definitely, Argentina will be on the list. Obviously, we're going to get rolling. We'll have to see how we can build up our network of contacts and get interesting people on. So the summer series has 3 shows planned at the moment, and we'll give you more details about those as we get closer to the launch of the show, which will be on Wednesday afternoon next week. So the 14th, Wednesday the 14th.
Wednesday the 14th. Well, everybody should mark that down in their calendars for next week and for the 3 weeks following that. And I look forward to welcoming you full-time onto Reality Check Radio after the summer series, fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. It'll depend a lot on what kind of feedback we get, whether it's working out for me and obviously working out for Reality Check Radio. And I'm very excited about it, and I know quite a few people are. So we hope to deliver. I don't want to overpromise too much, but I do think a focus on history, a focus on what people in similar predicaments as ours are doing overseas is really going to resonate with people because, as they say, history does not repeat, but it rhymes. And also, we know from the Bible that there is nothing new under the sun.
No, there is nothing new under the sun, but you're absolutely right regarding history. And, I've talked today with Ashley Church about history, and it seems to be repeating itself at the moment, particularly with regards to the rise of anti-Semitism and all of the awfulness that goes with that. But, yeah, we need to learn our lessons from history, and we ignore it at our peril.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have be able to look at some different and interesting perspectives on history as well. There's usually a range of opinions, even on current events, and that applies to all of history as well.
Well, look forward to hearing that next week. I'm going to certainly bookmark it when the show appears in the app. And if I can't listen to it live, then I'll try and listen to it on a replay. But I recommend to all of my listeners on The Crunch, give Dewa a go and give them the feedback that I enjoy, that I get, because that's the only feedback that we get as hosts is those emails and those texts. So Dewa, welcome to RCR, and I look forward to hearing your first show.
Thank you very much. I enjoy that, and as well, I've enjoyed writing for the BFD in the past year, and as a writer, it is those comments that you get on articles that you write that I really enjoy, and so being able to get feedback on a radio show will be just as valuable.
Fantastic. Look forward to it next Wednesday on Reality Check Radio, Dewa de Boer's new show.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.
I've had Ashley Church on before as well. Back then, we talked about our faith journeys. Today, though, I wanted to touch base with Ashley regarding his article about the Israel-Hamas conflict, its origins, and busting some myths that the media perpetrate. He joins me on the line now. Welcome back to The Crunch and the first Crunch of the year, Ashley Church.
G'day, Cam. Nice to see you again. Welcome to 2024. I hope it started well for you.
Yes, well, it's a battle always, but I'm looking forward to the first show, and I'm looking forward to RCR for the year. And, we moved the dial last year with RCR, with the election and all of that. So it's been fantastic to grow about. One area that I keep getting criticism on is I haven't yet commented on RCR regarding the Israel versus Hamas war that's been going since October 7.
Yep.
And I read your article that you wrote early on in that piece, a very reasoned article that showed both sides of the arguments and where you saw things lie. And certainly I'd refer readers to your website for that, which is at ashleychurch.com. And if you search for Israel and Hamas, the facts, you'll find Ashley's article. Just want to touch on what you cover in that article, Ashley.
Yeah, so basically where it came from was not long after this terrible attack took place on the 7th of October. I looked around, Cam, for some Q&A material that I could use in social media posts. That was really the genesis of it. And there was various stuff out there, but nothing that really covered the key data, and also nothing which extrapolated from what had happened on 7th October and explained the history and why that had actually happened. So I wrote one myself, and I wrote it, as you say, as a Q&A. And I tried to keep it as simple as possible. So it basically poses some questions, that it answers the questions, and it doesn't go into a huge amount of detail on the answers themselves. It gives just enough basically to answer the question, but it's chock full of hyperlinks, which means that where it answers in a 3 or 4 sentence answer, there are also hyperlinks which enable you to go and find much more information and videos and other things for anybody who really wants to get down into the deep and dirty.
Yeah.
So and then I put it out there, and it went mental. It got picked up all around the world. It got picked up by agencies in the States and Israel and other places, and became almost a de facto sort of a fact sheet on what was going on, which was great.
Yeah, it's very good. I mean, I've referred lots of people to it because it doesn't have any emotion in it. There's no right or wrong. These are just the facts. I mean, you even outline what Hamas is about and what they want, which people seem to forget.
And that's actually the starting point of it. But pretty much the first question it asks is, who is Hamas? And Hamas. So actually, the first question it asks is what happened on the 7th of October, and it goes into a bit of detail about the attack that took place at 6:30 in the morning, the fact that 1,200 people were slaughtered. Some of them in their sleep. They were people who, in many cases, had been in a music festival the night before. Babies were beheaded, women were raped. It was a terrible, terrible event. And had it happened anywhere else on Earth, Cam, it would have been the cause of massive outpouring of grief around the world. And there was a little bit of grief. It lasted about 5 minutes. And then it very, very quickly turned into what we saw, which was essentially blaming Israel for the fact that Hamas had attacked it. Anyway, back to your question. So the attack was conducted by Hamas, and they also took back into Israel about 240 hostages.
Hostages, yeah.
Yeah. Now, at that point, it's interesting to actually ask who Hamas are, or who they are as an organisation. So Hamas has been around since the 1980s. In fact, 1988 it first emerged, and it now rules the Gaza Strip. It is effectively, well, not effectively, it is the government of the Gaza Strip. So just for those who don't understand the politics, the Palestinian people on either side of Israel fall into 2 different territories. On one side is Gaza, which is the strip of land on the southwest coast of Israel, facing onto the Mediterranean. And on the other side of Israel is another piece of land called the West Bank. And that's ruled by a different organisation called Fatah, which is part of
That's where the Palestinian Liberation Organisation eventually became Fatah.
Correct, yeah. And so Fatah is a radical organisation as well, but it's nowhere near as radical as Hamas. So Hamas in 2005, after a form of occupation over that territory by Israel basically decided that they would pull out of Gaza in its entirety.
They offered it back to Egypt, didn't they?
Offered it back to Egypt. Egypt didn't want a bar of it. Egypt's got a big wall up that nobody talks about.
Huge wall, bigger than Israel's.
Wall, yeah. And so they basically left them to it. Quite quickly, the Palestinians and the Gaza Strip had an election. They elected Hamas to be their leadership. And Hamas has both a political wing and a military wing, although for all intents and purposes, they are essentially the same thing.
One and the same, yeah.
Yeah, and so determined were Israel to leave them to it that they actually forcibly removed 10,000 Jews who'd been living in Gaza, forcibly removed them, made them leave, and removed the graves of Israelis who had been buried in the Gaza Strip so that they wouldn't be desecrated.
And left all the infrastructure in place that they'd built.
The infrastructure and basically left them to it. So there was no occupation. So when the term occupation comes up, there was no occupation. It was left to its own devices. It was funded primarily from on the largesse and support of nations around the world and the UN, and it governed itself for a period of almost 20 years. And then they emerged, as I say, and to be fair, I mean, this didn't happen entirely in isolation. They've been bombing Israel with monotonous regularity over that 20-year period. But Israel has this thing called Iron Dome, which is a very effective defense mechanism which shoots down most of those missiles as they come in.
For many years, they didn't have it, though.
That's right. And so it was damaging infrastructure in Israel. Anyway, so Hamas have emerged and carried out this attack. And you might say, well, why have they done so? So it's important to understand who Hamas actually are.
Well, what does Hamas mean for a start? What does the word Hamas mean?
I'm not even going to attempt to give the Arab translation because I can't pronounce it, but it's an acronym which means Islamic Resistance Movement. In Hebrew, incidentally, as a coincidence, the word Hamas actually means violence, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And it's driven very much by, and this is a key thing to understand, it's driven by the same objectives which motivated ISIS. And in fact, according to a number of leading Muslim academics, not Western academics, Muslim academics, they actually say that it is ISIS. So for all intents and purposes, it operates in exactly the same way. Its purpose as an organization is not the creation of the Palestinian state. It's not to have peace with Israel. It's not any of these things that the protest movements claim that it is. Its movement is the annihilation of the state of Israel and the establishment of an Islamic caliphate. And in fact, if you go further than that, its long-term purpose, and it's made no secret of this, is a permanent state of total war and eventually the creation of a caliphate worldwide. So it's very clear in its objectives, not interested in peace, not interested in a state. It is determined to completely remove Israelis, which it sees as a blight on that land from that area in its entirety. Now, by the way, that's not my opinion. That comes from something called the Hamas Charter. And the Hamas Charter is available online for anybody who wants to read it. And it's very clear. It goes through what its objectives are, it goes through what its goals are, and it goes through its very clear attitude toward Jewish people and its desire for the elimination of Jews worldwide.
So when green politicians and various other people march down Queen Street and chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, what does that mean?
So the river in question, from a Hamas's perspective, they're talking about the Jordan River on the eastern side. So the Jordan River runs pretty much all the way up as a line between Jordan and Israel, right up to the Sea of Galilee,
and down to the Dead Sea.
And down to the Dead Sea, yeah. So that's a natural border on one side, and the sea is the Mediterranean. So the only piece of land that exists between those two geographical features is Israel itself. So what they're saying is, from the river to the sea, elimination of Israel in its entirety, and that's completely consistent, as I say, Cam, with the Charter of Hamas, which that's exactly what they say. Now, the irony of it is that the people who chant that phrase, and the people that protest and march in the streets that you just mentioned before around the streets of the Western world, in most cases have absolutely no idea what the river and the sea actually are. I watched, it would have been comedic if it wasn't so serious. But
it is comedic. Somebody's put a video out on YouTube asking protesters, well, what's the river? Exactly. And no one can answer it.
In fact, I think I saw somebody saying that the Balkans was the sea was the Balkans, for God's sake.
Or the sea was the Black Sea.
Yeah,
which of course borders Ukraine, Russia, and Turkey. Nowhere near this area. Same with the river; they couldn't name what the river was either.
Yeah, completely right. So it's very easy to make these chants and to get up and talk about the river to the sea. But when you actually analyse what they mean by that, it is an horrific call to genocide of the Jewish people.
Now, just to touch on that.
Yep.
How many Jews live in Gaza?
None, not one.
Yeah. How many Jews live in Syria?
There'd be less than 50.
How many Jews live in Lebanon?
Probably a few more, but again, less than a couple of hundred.
And Jordan?
Again, there might be someone doing business in Jordan because Israel has a peace treaty with Jordan, but long-term residents might be 400 or 500. Certainly wouldn't be any more than that.
Saudi Arabia?
Oh, none.
And Egypt?
Same as Jordan. They have a peace treaty with Egypt, so there would be probably a greater degree of commercial relationship between
them. But a few hundred.
Few hundred maybe, yeah. Certainly not many. We're certainly not talking thousands.
Yeah, so I named those countries on purpose. They're the countries who have borders with Israel.
Yep.
And so when they say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, what they really mean will be free of Jews.
Correct. Absolutely correct.
Just like it is in all those countries around.
Absolutely correct. Incidentally, there's a corollary to that question, which is how many people of those various different ethnicities live in Israel. Who might have descendancy or ancestry in those various different nations.
How many Arab Israelis are there?
2 million in Israel, living in Israel with the same rights as Israeli citizens.
So that then leads to the other claim that people make about Israel is that it's an apartheid state.
It's a nonsense. And the only
are there any laws that Israel has that prevents a non-Jewish person from, I don't know, being an MP? Or a judge or a teacher?
There is one law and one law only that differentiates between Jewish Israelis and all others, and it's actually a negative law for Jews. All Jews have to perform 2 years military service, compulsory military service. Jews of Israelis who are not of Jewish descent are exempted from that being compulsory.
But there's plenty of Arab Israelis in the IDF, isn't there? Yeah,
and they do that voluntarily. But in respect of the broad question that you asked, in respect of every other aspect of life, completely equal. So the rights are the same. I think where this suggestion of apartheid comes from, Cam, firstly, it comes from people who don't understand. So they say this stuff without actually having a clue of what they're talking about.
Yeah.
But secondly, it comes from a misunderstanding of the status of Gaza and the status of the West Bank. So Gaza, as I said before, has run as effectively as an independent state for 20 years. So its people are citizens of Gaza. They're not citizens of Israel. And I think if you postulate this claim that protesters do that it's been occupied by Israel and it's separated from Israel, that's the only way, if you stand on your head and put your hand behind your back, you might be able to claim that there's some form of apartheid, but it simply isn't true. It's a completely separate nation.
But many Arabs in Gaza actually worked in Israel, didn't they?
They did, and it's interesting because that's clearly not happening at the moment for obvious reasons. And so Israel is currently bringing in tens of thousands of Indian workers who are very, very thankful of the work that was previously being conducted by Gazans. And the reasons Gazans did it was because the wages and the salaries that they were able to earn in Israel were substantially more than they could ever have earned in Gaza. And they were able to feed their families and look after themselves. Well, that's all gone. Hamas has destroyed that.
So what about the claims that this is a freedom movement, that there was a brutal siege by Israel on Gaza that wouldn't permit any water or electricity or all of these sorts of things, foodstuffs going into Gaza?
Yeah, so that's not true. That's simply not true. In fact, there have been has been an enormous amount of humanitarian aid that's gone into Gaza since Israel has moved in there after October 7th. But about 70% of that by IDF estimates has been stolen by Hamas and is being used essentially to support their soldiers and the people that are fighting the Israelis. So it's not getting to the people it's aimed at. And so from Israel's perspective, Israel's actually going above and beyond. It's doing things that you simply wouldn't expect in wartime of a party to that conflict. And that's pretty typical of Israel, not just in respect of the provision of humanitarian aid, but also in respect of all sorts of other things. When they have moved into an area to clear out Hamas, they have made sure first that they've let the citizens of Gaza in that particular area know. They've created clear paths protected by the IDF so that people could move south when that was happening. They've gone out of their way to protect the citizens of Gaza and done everything that they possibly could to minimise any casualties of civilians and to make sure that they're focusing almost in their entirety on the combatants from Hamas itself, which is in clear conflict to the nonsense you're hearing in the media about how they're attacking indiscriminately. That's simply not true.
I visited Israel in 2014, And
great place, isn't it?
Fantastic. It reminded me a lot of New Zealand, maybe 40 years ago, this real can-do attitude. But when I was in Sderot, being rocketed by Hamas when I was there, at one point, I think it was like 15 missiles in 5 minutes, which is kind of frightening. But those people live there 900 yards from the Gaza border with bomb shelters and all those. But I said to the people that were running the tour, well, how does Gaza get its power and its water? And they said, oh, from us.
Yes.
I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we've got a nuclear power station at Ascalon, another one at Ashdod, and we also pump fresh water into there.
Yep.
And provide most of the services there. And I said, oh, do they pay for that? No, we do it for free.
Yeah.
And at that point, there was rockets being aimed at those nuclear power stations, which provide the power for Gaza. I couldn't work it out. I just could not work it out.
Extraordinary, Cam, the lengths to which Israel will go to provide, I guess, what it sees as its humanitarian responsibilities to a people that it didn't create, who were created by events that happened in 1948, but who it has taken on an obligation to play its part in looking after them. Interestingly, too, not just in regard to humanitarian aid, but even you might have noticed over the last couple of days, there's been some reports around some IDF forces that appear, we don't know yet because it hasn't been investigated, but it appear to have killed somebody who killed a Palestinian for whom it wasn't apparent that they were a combatant in cold blood. Now, the reason that's important, and I'm sure there'll be all sorts of media about how terrible that is and how merciless it was.
Is this the guy that had his hands up?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's being investigated at the moment. But here's what's important about that. That made the evening news. It was the lead story in Israel. It's being investigated by multiple agencies in Israel. In other words, the apparatus of the state, the apparatus of the military is turning itself on its head to find out who did it, what the story behind it is, and to take action if they find that it was actually done in a way that was malicious. Now, now compare that to Hamas, who killed 1,200 people in cold blood on the 7th of October and have shown no regard not just for the human life of Israelis, but for the civilians in Gaza, who it's actually used as human shields in order to protect itself from the attempts by the Israelis to eliminate it. So the contrast between the Western ethical values of Israel, which regards every life as precious, and the values of Hamas, which are basically bloodthirsty and will do whatever is necessary in order to achieve their aims.
Now, it kind of moves on to the allegations that every time there's a conflict like this, where Israel reacts to defend its citizens, and this was let's put it plainly, it was an invasion by Hamas, who is the sovereign government of Gaza. So it was an act of war against Israel on December the 7th.
Correct.
Hamas broke the existing truce that was in place by doing it.
Yep.
And Israel responded with immense firepower and overwhelming thing. Now, there's this call that the protesters make that the response should be proportionate. Now, study military history. I'm a member of Antique Arms, so I kind of know all of this sort of stuff. In World War II, when the Allies bombed Dresden and created a firestorm and killed tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of German citizens, there were no calls for proportionate response then. When the Allies bombed, or the United States bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima, there was no calls for a proportionate response to the Japanese tyranny that was, So
this concept of proportionality, Cam, has no basis.
Well, I can't work it out, because if you're conducting a war, if you're proportionate, you're never going to end that war. It's going to be a stalemate. It'll be like World War I, where there was a proportionate response and was met with trenches, and it became a 4-year stalemate that killed millions of people. So that's what happens, isn't it, if you have proportionate responses?
Absolutely. And so your example of the Germans is particularly prescient, because there were far more, and I haven't got the number in my head, but there were far more Germans killed during World War II than there were Allied forces killed. But the
And
Germans were the
citizens
aggressors.
and civilians as well. Far more German
Yes.
civilians killed.
Yeah. But the Germans were the aggressors. It was the Germans who were attacking. So do we turn around? Should Churchill have turned around and said, "Well, we have to pull back. We have to be proportionate in our response because we're killing too many Germans"? That would be a nonsense. And I think any decent, reasonable person sees that there's a logical fallacy in that sort of approach. And yet, that's exactly what's being argued here. The other thing that's important to understand is that within that, that fallacious concept of proportionality, the IDF is targeting overwhelmingly. It's targeting Hamas. It's targeting Hamas combatants. Now, we're hearing all sorts of figures at the moment coming from the Gaza Health Ministry of figures of sort of 25,
It's controlled by
30,000
Hamas.
people, which is controlled by Hamas. It's exactly right. That would be like listening to Goebbels and the propaganda ministry during World War II, giving us all our information about casualties during that conflict. It's exactly the same thing. So, A, we don't know if that number's correct, and B, equally importantly, we don't know how that number's made up. And it may well be that the vast majority, in fact, I suspect we'll find it is when when the smoke settles, the vast majority of those people are actually Hamas combatants. So, and then people say, well, there's women and children. There are women combatants and there are child combatants. In fact, Hamas has made almost a science of using children as suicide bombers over the last 20 years. So this idea that women and children are somehow exempt because they've got some sort of naivety in the whole process is not
Well, there's
true.
plenty of videos out there of children in UNRWA. That's the refugee organization created by the United Nations for Palestinians. UNRWA schools where they're dressed up as Hamas terrorists, subjugating an Israeli. It's treated like a dog on the ground or got guns to their heads or being stomped on. There's plenty of videos of school-age children being indoctrinated under the auspices of the United Nations.
And Cam, that's another thing, and I know we're jumping around a bit, but that's a really important topic. So there's this whole issue at the moment around UNRWA and what's going on there and this discovery that, and at the moment they're only saying 12. They're talking about 12 UNRWA employees.
It's more than that. It's more like 1,200.
Exactly. So UNRWA employs about 30,000 people, of which about 90% are Palestinians. There's only a very small number of those people who aren't actually.
The rest are probably foreign nationals from various parts of the UN delegate. Yeah.
Now, what's important to understand is that, and the idea that this has only just emerged and it's only something that's only happened and it's just a very, very small problem.
Oh, that's rubbish, isn't it?
There have been organisations for the last 15 years. In fact, an organisation I belong to, the Israel Institute of New Zealand, along with David Kuhlman, we've been bringing this information to the New Zealand government's attention for several years. We had a meeting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade about 4 years ago where we outlined to them the fact that UNRWA employees have produced school books which teach kids to hate Jews and that violence is an honourable pursuit, that have been giving money to Hamas for the purchasing of property, for the building.
It's worse
of
than that, though. It isn't. It's not just perpetrating violence. It's teaching them that Shaheed martyrdom is an admirable goal for a child to aspire to.
Absolutely. So this idea that all we've got to do is just get rid of bad apples and reform UNRWA is complete nonsense. It is rotten, Cam, to the core. It is rotten to the core. It needs to be disbanded. And if there's to be an agency of that kind, it needs to be something completely different. And in my view, it shouldn't be run by the UN because it's proved itself completely inept and incapable of doing that.
Well, I've been following, UN Watch for probably 15 years where they've been raising these issues. I understand it's more than 20 years that they've been raising these issues of UNRWA's inappropriate funding of terrorist ideology.
Well, those tunnels, the 500, almost 500 miles of tunnels that they've so far found in Gaza didn't make themselves. They came from somewhere. But it's just horrendous, and this idea that, as I said before, this idea that it's just a few bad apples and it can be resolved is nonsense. And New Zealand and every other nation that funds this organisation need to cut funding completely and look for something completely new to produce that. By the way, UNRWA itself is interesting because UNRWA was created in the wake of the so-called refugee crisis of 1948, when the two Palestinian states or territories were created. There is another agency that handles refugee causes around the world. It's the Office of the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner. And so UNRWA looks after Palestinian refugees and the office of the refugee, the other office looks after every other refugee in the world. Now, the interesting thing about the UNRWA is it's got a very specific definition of what is a refugee that's different to anywhere else on the planet. And by that definition, the 800,000 people who were originally refugees in 1948 have exploded out to 5 million. So they now count there as being 5 million refugees 70 years on, which is complete nonsense. That counts people that have
hang on a second.
People that have moved to Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, moved on with their lives, had kids. They're still counted as refugees by that agency.
But hang on a minute. Israel's charged with committing genocide.
I know where you're going.
But the population of Palestinians has increased. What's that? That's about 500%, isn't it?
But yeah, fivefold. It's a nonsense. So, but even if that weren't the case, just the international definition of genocide is clear, and there are a number of different moving parts to what constitutes genocide. One of them is scale. One of the big ones is scale, and the other one's intent. And the scale would have to be, if you want to look for scale, there have been conflicts in Yemen and various other locations around the world over the last 20 years where you've seen millions of people slaughtered.
Rwanda.
Yeah, those are scale. That's scale. The 20,000 that we're talking who are most likely mostly combatants is not scale. And the intent, Israel has been clear on its intent. Its intent is to remove Hamas from existence, from any form of power. That is not genocide. It's gone out of its way to protect the civilian citizens of that country, sometimes under duress, because those citizens don't always want to be protected. But Israel's done everything it can. It's done absolutely the opposite, Cam, of what the international definition of genocide tells us a genocidal nation would do if that was actually its intent.
Yeah, I found it interesting that these claims of genocide started almost immediately once Israel pushed back, defending their country from an invasion.
Yeah.
And I thought it rather strange if you're a genocidal country run by genocidaires, that telling a civilian population that you're about to invade a particular city or an area, and perhaps you might like to move south, would have been contrary to the goals of being genocidal.
And telling them by dropping millions of flyers to tell them it's happening, to ring every phone number, every cell phone number that they can get, that they have available to them from Israel, to actually ring them and speak to them in Arabic and tell them the attack's coming, and so various different other ways. No army in the world does that. No other army in the world goes to those sorts of measures to try and protect the people of the nation where it's attacking.
In fact, they created a corridor of tanks. To facilitate the movement of those civilians, because Hamas were trying to kill them while they were moving.
Hamas was shooting them if they tried to move south. So the Israelis were doing their best to protect them from that. It's the use of language in this conflict is stunning. The difference between the reality of what's happening on the ground and the language which is being used by the media and by the protest movement, the disconnect between those two things is like I have never seen anything like it before. I suspect if I went back to the period during World War II when this was starting to happen to the Jews, then we're probably talking about something that's on a similar scale to that. The difference this time being that the Jews are in a position to actually do something about it. They're not being attacked by an enemy who's completely overrun them.
We'll come back to the genocide in a minute, because I want to touch on the ICJ preliminary orders, etc. But I just want to focus on the population, the Palestinian population, and the key date that everybody talks about, which is, of course, 1948, when Israel declared independence, formed the State of Israel. The Palestinians call this the Nakba.
They do.
I think it translates to the tragedy or something like that.
Yeah.
Or the travesty or something.
The trauma or something.
The trauma, and they say that's the point at which they were dispossessed of something that they already owned. That's not true, though, is it? In 1948, there was no country of Palestine.
Well, this is the funny thing.
That was controlled by Arab Palestinians.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the narrative again from the protest movement is that as you say, that the Israelis overran an existing nation and took the land, and that that they should be forced to give it back, and that's based on the idea that there was previously a Palestinian state. Cam, there has never been a independent Palestinian state in history, and don't believe me, go and have a look online, do a search on great kings of Palestine or great events in Palestinian history. You won't find anything. You won't find anything because it doesn't exist. The land, I mean, I won't bore you going too far back, except to say that the Israeli connection to that land goes back at least 3,000 years and possibly longer. The Jewish and Jews were part of that country, were occupants of that country through a succession of conquerors, right up in large numbers, right up until about the 6th century AD. And what changed was the successive Muslim invasions and the invasion of Jerusalem as well as other parts of the Middle East by about sort of 680, 690 AD. The Muslims were really putting the heat on the Jews, and there was a mass exodus of them off to other parts of the world, to Europe and to other parts of the Middle East. But they continued to have a connection. There's an unbroken connection of Jews to that land right up until 1948. Now, there were other people living there. There were other Arabs.
Yep.
And the people we call Palestinians today are ethnically most likely to be of Jordanian descent, or what we now call Jordanian. Jordan didn't exist back then either.
So in 1948, though, it was a British protectorate.
Yeah.
Called Palestine. And how did it become a British protectorate, and at what stage did it become a British protectorate?
Yeah, so between the 17th century, the 16th century, and the beginning of the 20th century, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, which was
Turkey.
State. But for Turkey, correct.
Yep.
And obviously, Turkey was one of the powers that Britain defeated at the end of World War One, and that was essentially the end of their hold on the Middle East, and that was taken control of by the French and the British. And the British went about basically creating what they hoped would be democratic states in the Middle East. So they created the state of Iraq, they created the state of, they created Lebanon, they created Syria, Egypt was obviously already there, and they created Jordan. So they created the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. So although that's a kingdom, in other words, it has a king, that royal family was only created in 1947, in fact, that was created. And that was intended to be a Palestinian state because the majority of the people who lived there were what we now call Palestinians.
It was actually originally called Transjordan, wasn't it?
Correct.
Because it was both sides of the Jordan River, the West Bank and the other side.
Yep. Now, the land that's now occupied by the Jews, Israel, that was the remainder of what had originally been a proposal to create a much larger state. In fact, the talk of that started in 1917 under the auspices of a guy called Balfour. And the Balfour Declaration was essentially the founding document upon which Britain decided that it would do what it could to actually establish a Jewish state in the Middle East. But over the following 30 years, it was horse trading between the Brits and the Arabs, mostly around trade links and trade routes, etc. And they continually reduced that down to what was finally a very, very small sliver of land. And in 1948, probably driven by guilt of what had happened to the Jews during the Holocaust, the relatively newly formed United Nations voted on petitioning that. The Brits walked away from it. They didn't want a bar of that, so they voted against the petition and then left. And that newly created state was created in June 1948. The following day, and I should mention too, when that happened, in the weeks leading up to that, because obviously the Jews were aware that this was all taking place at the UN. The Jews put a call out to the Arabs that lived in Israel at the time and said, "Stay here and work with us, and we will build a new country."
And some did.
Well, the 2 million that are there now, they are mainly the descendants of the people that decided to stay. So they became citizens of Israel like any other citizen and have full rights just like any other Israeli does. The ones that did, but the remaining states in the Middle East put the call out to those that live there and said, "No, don't stay. Basically, escape to the borders because we're going to move in and we're going to clean out the Jews, and then you can go back."
And for those who left and went to Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt, what happened to them?
Well, they were treated terribly. So that's the other.
They're still in camps, aren't they?
They are. So there are Palestinian refugees in all of those countries as well as on the borders of Israel. But you don't hear about those others because that doesn't fit the narrative around the terrible colonial Israeli aggressors. So there are Palestinian refugees in all sorts of places. But the ones that we hear about today are the ones that went to both sides of Israel, to Gaza, the Gaza Strip that we talked about before, and to the West Bank, which is bordered by Jordan on one side and Israel on the other. Now, here's what's interesting is the Gaza Strip was actually annexed by Egypt up until 1967. So Egypt actually controlled the Gazan Palestinians for a long period of time after the war.
Well, it was part of Egypt, wasn't it?
Correct.
The Gaza Strip and the Sinai, and in 1966.
Yep. And here's the thing, Cam, the Egyptians found it unmanageable. And they pulled out. They don't want to borrow it. And since then, they've built a massive Great Wall, which you never hear about in media because it doesn't fit the narrative. And because in my view, the best solution to the problem there would be basically to let Egypt annex it again and take it into Egypt and make it part of Egyptian territory. But that will never happen. The Egyptians will never do
So in 1948 was the creation of the State of Israel.
Yep.
Right between 1917 and 1948, it was a British protectorate.
Correct.
France obviously had a bit to say in Syria and Lebanon.
Yep.
For that period of time. Prior to 1917, it was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Correct.
And from about 1566, if my history serves me right, that area was controlled by the Ottoman Empire.
Absolutely correct.
And before that,
a series
of empires, including the Seljuks and various different Egyptian military dictatorships for several hundred years before that as well.
10 in total between about 632 and 1917. There were 10 different caliphates in charge of that territory, all Islamic.
Yeah. So
none of which had a base in the territory that we now refer to as Palestine. They were all based elsewhere. Some were in Egypt, some were in Turkey.
And of course, the name Palestine comes from the Romans. It was a Latinization of Philistines.
Correct. So
biblically, the Philistines lived in Gaza.
They did. They lived in Tyre and also down in Gaza. And what's interesting about the Philistines, there is absolutely no ethnic link between the Philistines, who disappeared from history, and the people that we now refer to as the Palestinians, who we know where they've come from. They've come from other parts of the Middle East. So they are, it's one of the questions I get asked is well, does that mean there's no Palestinians? Well, of course there's Palestinians, in the same way that New Zealanders and Australians are a people that didn't exist 300 years ago.
It's like saying, such thing as Cappadocians, when in fact they're all Turks, right? Because the Ottoman Empire encompassed all of that area, and they all become Turks.
Yeah. But the point I was going to make was it's okay to refer to them as Palestinians. There's nothing wrong with that.
No.
But don't confuse that with the historical people that lived in that territory, because they're not the same people. They're completely different people. So this idea that there's a link between them to somehow form this imaginary tie to the land that doesn't exist is historically inaccurate.
Okay, so that's given a little bit of history and everything. So now we get to the main charge that is hurled at Israel, that they're committing genocide. And we've just seen South Africa take a case to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide. But they didn't find that in their finding that, ironically, they announced the day before National Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Yeah.
International Remembrance Day. Kind of rude of them to do that. But anyway, they did. The only orders they made, though, in that, and it hasn't been reported in the media, they made no orders of Israel. They said, you've got to be careful. And the Israelis said, thank you very much, we will be careful. But the only order they made was for Hamas to release the hostages.
Correct. There's a slightly different slant on the orders. So the orders were more in the nature of asking somebody if they're still bashing their wife. In that there's no possible answer to that, because if you're not, what do you say? So basically, they gave 5 orders which had an inference that something bad was going on and Israel should stop doing it. but without any evidence that there was anything. And Israel basically came back, as you say, and said, well, we're happy to comply with those because we're not doing them. There was also an inference that there will be a subsequent, and it's worth pointing out that the lowest threshold for proving a genocide was at this early stage because there is no evidence. South Africa didn't actually produce any evidence. They produced headlines and quotes made by people that didn't actually produce any evidence of genocide. There will be probably a more substantive report that we'll get 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, which will be completely meaningless. But you're absolutely correct, Cam. In respect of what came out of that tribunal's finding a few weeks ago, there was no finding of genocide. Now, that's in contrast to when you go online now on social media, you'll see people talking about how even the ICJ has found that Israel was committing genocide. It's nonsense. It's not true.
Yeah, people like Martin Bradbury and John Linto and all the screaming skulls out there that hate Israel and Jews. They're the ones who are all saying that. But the only order that was given by the ICJ was for Hamas to hand over the hostages.
Absolutely correct. And it was interesting because they almost gave those, and this probably gives even more credence to it, because when you watch that, the deliverance of that, it was done through gritted teeth, which means that tribunal would have, if it could possibly have found anything that it could have.
They would have.
They would have, because they certainly weren't partisan toward Israel, quite the opposite. But they were unable to find any evidence of genocide. Why? Because there isn't genocide going on there for all the reasons that I explained before. So that was a kangaroo court. It was jacked up by that claim from South Africa. All the weight was given to South Africa, by the way. It was interesting. Germany inserted itself as a party to those proceedings, and its reason for that, and I thought it was actually pretty gutsy of Germany to do it, was because if any nation understood genocide, it would be them.
Well, they wrote the manual, didn't they?
They did, and they inserted themselves on the side of Israel and said, "Well, we want to be heard because this isn't genocide. We'll tell you what genocide looks like." And that's been given no weight. Yeah.
So did South Africa do this out of their great benevolence and their concern for the Palestinian people? Or is there some ulterior motive there?
Yeah, when it first happened, the claim was that they were doing it because they understood apartheid and, that they would – all that's nonsense. What we've learned since then is that the whole thing was funded by Iran, who apparently had paid off ANC debt. So this is basically an incident of one hand scratching the other. So this was another ploy by Iran, and we haven't talked about Iran yet. This was another ploy by Iran to try and influence public opinion and world opinion on what's going on in Israel by using proxies. So in this case,
how much was this debt? Is it like 50,000 or something like that?
Oh no, we'd be talking. I don't know what it is, but we talk millions.
Well, I do. I took the liberty of looking it up.
Right.
It's 120 million rand.
So there you go. So 30 pieces of silver.
Yeah. So, and also that's a debt that the ANC had, and they were about to be have a judgment lodged against them, which means that the ANC would have ceased to exist as a political party, and that would have been the end of the government in South Africa. And a few days after the 7th of October, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of South Africa visited Iran, and then the government of South Africa expressed solidarity with the Palestinians to 100% in a public display broadcast on television. Yep. And then magically 120 million rand drops into the ANC's accounts and they've managed to pay off their debt. Yep. But I'm told that the legal team that was assembled for this genocide case in the ICJ would have cost not less than 200 million to prepare and argue for the final trial. And it'll be about 1.5 billion rand for the whole thing.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So this is Iran meddling in world affairs to promulgate their terrorist beliefs, actually.
And that's not new, Cam. So Iran's a known majority contributor to Hamas in Gaza, has been for a very long time. It also funds another terrorist organization in Lebanon called Hezbollah, which is involved in similar sorts of activities. In fact, they've been, at the same time this has been going on, they've been firing missiles into northern Israel. Exactly, they'll be next. But also various other organizations around the world. Iran is a massive player in funding terrorist activities around the world, and this was just another part of that process. Now, it's interesting because when I look, two of us talked about this. It sounds like conspiratorial old men. Go and check it out. Don't take my word for it. Don't take your word for it. Go and actually check out the various headlines. Even tomes that are not particularly well favoured toward Israel, like the New York Times and the Guardian in the UK. Go and read the stuff in those publications, because as much as they might be gritting their teeth when they say it, they've all written about it. So it's not hard to understand. Follow the money. The old saying, follow the money. It's not hard to understand where this stuff's coming from and why. Iran's made no secret over the last 20 or 30 years of its determination to eliminate the Jewish state, and this is just another part of that process.
I see in the news on Wednesday morning that Israel has discovered in the tunnels vast quantities of cash and proof that Iran has been funding to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, US dollars, Hamas. And they've discovered this in the tunnels. So the evidence is building now of Iran's malign influence in these conflict areas, that if they hadn't funded Hamas and Hezbollah and these other organizations, then maybe we would actually have peace in the region.
Yeah, I don't know whether we'd have peace, but we would have, the whole thing would have played out differently because they wouldn't have had the resources. Hamas and Hezbollah wouldn't have had the resources that they've had, and so the result of the whole thing would have been different. But it's a unique period of history when you've got a terrorist organization running essentially a nation, because that's what Gaza is. And world opinion coming down heavily, certainly for the first part of this conflict, in favour of that terrorist organisation. I've never seen anything like it. The one good thing about it is that, you would have noticed this too over the last few months, as more information has come out and as that information has tended to support the Israeli position, that the mood is slowly, too slowly for my liking, but the mood is changing. The mood of the world is changing. And you're not even seeing the same degree of activity from the protest groups that you were seeing in that first couple of months. They've gone a lot more quiet, and you're hearing a lot more from nation states that are actually finally coming down one side or the other and supporting Israel. So that's heartening, but it should have happened 4 months ago.
What I can't get over is the absolute denial of the atrocity that occurred on October the 7th. Now, totally. I was invited to a briefing to see the footage that was actually from Hamas cameras of what went on. It's the most harrowing 40 minutes I've ever seen. And being a student of war and understanding these things and having relatives that served in Gallipoli and in Vietnam, nothing could prepare me for those sights and sounds that I witnessed. People ask me, why did I watch that? And I gave the same answer that General Eisenhower gave at the end of World War II when he was inspecting the death camps, and he said, get the media in here, get the press in here, record everything, photograph it, video it, because, and this is a quote, some bastard somewhere down the track is going to deny this ever happened.
Yeah.
And that's why I watched that, and it was appalling.
Yeah.
People say that, the beheading of babies didn't happen. Well, they in the videos that I saw, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. And I couldn't agree with you more.
It took me just to put it in perspective. Right? I'm a fairly tough sort of a guy, right? I could not speak for hours after that. It was so shocking.
Even, I mentioned before the New York Times, and they're certainly not partial toward Israel. They did an investigation, which I honestly believe when they started, they thought was going to find the opposite. They were going to find that it had been exaggerated by the IDF, and they came out with an absolutely stunning indictment of Hamas, the sexual crimes that they'd committed, the repeated rapes, what had happened during that time, which, and this is the New York Times we're talking, which moved the dial on that debate quite substantially about 2 months ago. Yeah. And we'll see more of that, I think, as the history of this thing slowly plays out and we see more and more of what actually took place. This will be, albeit not on the same scale, but this will be every bit as horrific as some of the detail of what took place during the Holocaust, which raises an interesting question, Cam, because it is that this stuff keeps happening to the Jews. This stuff keeps happening, and this is not new. The Holocaust wasn't the first time. This stuff's been going on.
No, there's been pogroms and all sorts.
Yeah.
Ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, and it raises a question. And in my article, when I get to the end of the article, I say, why does this happen? Why is it? Because it's anti-Semitism. Where does it come from? And for me, and this is getting into airy-fairy stuff for some people, you simply can't justify this on rational grounds. You cannot find a logical cause for this. You cannot argue logically why people would ignore the reality and the facts and hate the Israelis and the Jews in the way that they do right around the Western world. You have to look at it and say there is something else at play here that's not normal. Because otherwise, why do people act this way toward Jews in a way that they don't toward any other nation in history? And that, for me, and I suspect for you, is one of the big reasons I'm so motivated to do what I can.
Yeah, I'm motivated by a number of reasons. One is my core religious beliefs.
Same. Yeah.
The second thing is that I believe that the mainstream media are propagating lies about Israel and lies about the conflict and lies about the integrity of the government of Gaza in the form of Hamas. And I see it as a responsibility to be the other side of the narrative, to be the balance, because the balance is missing in our New Zealand media and indeed in worldwide media on these issues. It's a terrible blindness that the media and Western nations have when it comes to dealing with Israel.
Couldn't agree with you more.
And so I see it as my responsibility to be the balance and not to get tied up in emotional arguments and silly arguments, just deal like we have today in a nice, rational conversation dealing with facts, verifiable facts, independently verified facts, that these things happened, that this is why this is happening, and this is what the history is, and this is the history of the area and all of those sorts of things. Because if you fail to understand history, then you are doomed to repeat the errors of that history.
Totally.
And so that's why I subjected myself to watching that video. That's why I've been vocal in other media platforms. But I wanted to take the heat out of this debate, despite multiple calls, for months on end, for me to cover this on the show. I wanted to do it in a calm and rational manner, in keeping with, my new persona, so to speak. Nice, Cam, right? And so, Ashley, I thank you for coming on the show today to rationally explain that without getting into any heated arguments or discussions about. We're just dealing with facts. And I implore people to go to your website. That's easy to find. Do a search for ashleychurch.com and search for Israel and Hamas, the facts. You'll find a very good summation with huge numbers of links to this conflict, and hopefully people will understand it a little bit better and look on the news that they're getting from the mainstream media as suspicious as to its origins.
Thanks, mate. Always enjoy our time, and I look forward to our next chat on whatever topic it might be.
Well, you're welcome on the Crunch at any time, Ashley. Thank you for coming.
Take care. Talk soon.
I really recommend you seek out Ashley's article. It is very, very informative. Search for ashleychurch.com, Israel and Hamas, and you'll find it easily. It's a difficult topic to discuss dispassionately, but I reckon we gave it a good go. Let me know your thoughts on this topic, good or bad, by emailing inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
You've heard the words open, fair, both sides of the story. It's easy to say them, but practicing them often seems like a bridge too far. New Zealand, it's time for a reality check. RCR, Reality Check Radio. Rational discussion, common sense, and open debate for real. With me, Paul Brennan.
You just can't make this stuff up. You couldn't write the script.
Veteran broadcaster Peter Williams.
Where is the evidence they actually make a difference? It turns out that was a very fair question to ask.
Taking on the mainstream, Chantel Baker.
Mainstream media, as usual, in their little perch.
The man who cares so much and whose background is for real, Rodney Hyde.
The doctors don't believe them. They can't get ACC. They can't work. They're told it's all in their head.
Along with a raft of contributors to inform, entertain, and bring the truth back to New Zealand media. It's time for a reality check, all right. RCR, Reality Check Radio at www.realitycheck.radio. We've arrived.
Our text machine is now live. Send us your thoughts by texting your message to 2057. That's 2057. So get in touch with us now.
Now it's time for Cam's Buddies. This week we'll find out what they think about Waitangi Day, the Treaty of Waitangi, and the so-called principles of the treaty, along with their views on ACT's Treaty Principles Bill. My producer has them all lined up and ready to go. And let's go for the first Cam's Buddies of the year and a little surprise for you all. Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Lindley, and you are the first female buddy and you volunteered to come on the show, so welcome to Cam's Buddies.
Well, thanks, Cam. That's absolutely lovely. And I hope I get through this very first time. I'm a virgin buddy, you know. Get through this one piece, eh?
Yeah, I think you will. You'll be just fine. So the topic that I want to talk about tonight is the Treaty of Waitangi and the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi and David Seymour's bill to try and cement what these principles are. And I really appreciate your thoughts on that.
Well, as you know, I've only had 24 hours to actually get all this together, but I am faintly familiar with the principles and the treaty and various things. But I really would rather bring to your attention something else, which is prior to the principles, the bill with what David Seymour is trying to address. Yep. Because what about principles themselves before we start arguing over the Treaty of Waitangi principles? Now, the biggest principle is respect. And I don't think that respect has been addressed at all in this whole scrap. And I listened to David's speech today at Waitangi, and it was a perfect example of what I'm talking about, because you can't set principles when you haven't even got respect as a starting point. Now, in David Seymour's speech, I listened to that, and there was 3 points that I noticed, and one was, why in the middle of it did he ridicule Donald Trump, for heaven's sake, mentioning about him being reduced to an insect? I thought, no matter what you think of that man, that is extremely disrespectful. And then the members of the, at Waitangi, they were all making noises and drowned him out. That was disrespectful. The elders who let that go, that was disrespectful. And I thought, well, if you can't even start with respect between one another, how on earth are you ever going to honour the principles of the treaty?
Those are very good points that you make there, Lindley, and I 100% agree with you. There needs to be respect in this discourse on both sides of the argument. And until we have that respect, we're just going to have a shouting match going backwards and forwards and end up with a complete mess.
Exactly, and as you know, like begets like, and that is also in the emotional sense, not only the physical. And if you're going to go around being horrible and disrespectful, you're going to attract it back.
Yep, that's
and
right.
And it just goes tit for tat.
Yep, people pick up what you're putting down, and if you're putting down insults, they'll be picking up insults.
Exactly. So I just wanted to raise that point because I know that your other buddies will come in with all the detail of the people involved and all that sort of thing, and I just want to address it from this particular angle.
I think it's a good angle. I think it's a really good angle, that we need to have this mutual respect. The big issue that I have with the whole thing is that there's absolute outright misinformation, or it might actually be disinformation, deliberately wrong, where people are claiming that David Seymour is wanting to rewrite the treaty, and he's not.
No.
It's about defining the principles of the treaty, which is only a line in a piece of law that no one's actually defined yet. And it seems to me that we should be having a discussion about this, a grown-up discussion without insults, so that we can actually try and solve this problem so it's not a movable feast going into the future where the lawyers and the judges and the activists try and move the principles to something that were never intended by the treaty in the first place.
Well, I totally agree with you, and I do think that David Seymour, that is his intent, I believe. But we'll see how he goes. But I've written down several principles that we all need to learn about, and they're at the base of this treaty, and they are respect, honesty, truth, peace, morality, and compassion. Now, my question is, have we, as a species, evolved to this point? No, we haven't.
No.
So 2040, that's what the question was, what was your vision?
Yeah.
I would like a vision like that, and because that's in the broadest sense, we've never achieved it, and we've certainly never achieved it in politics of all places. And that's what I would like to see. I'd like to see humans evolve to that point and then worry about principles of their treaties and different things like that, because the Treaty of Waitangi, after all, even for the most simple or uneducated person or the youngest person or the oldest person, it is so simple.
Yes, 3 articles that define what we are to be as a nation. And there's no principles in the treaty. There's just 3 articles. No. And we need to sort this out because some fool politician decided that they would use the clause principles of the Treaty of Waitangi in legislation and leaving it open and up to judges. And we all know what judges are like. I mean, they don't even sentence criminals to jail when they desperately deserve it. So leaving that to the judges is the worst thing ever, and it's poor legislation that was promulgated on New Zealand society back in 1975, I think it was, when the Waitangi Tribunal was created.
Right. Well, I absolutely agree with that, but the problem is usually that treaty is so simple that there has to be, and usually is with anything like that, when activists get in and want it changed, there's usually an agenda behind it, and the agenda is almost always money and power. They're not really interested in making the treaty wording perfect at all. They just want to change it so that they can capitalise on it for their goal. That's my experience of people. People are greedy. They do want power.
Yep.
And they'll go for it. And if they've got even an inkling of getting a foot in the door, they will push and go all the way.
Yeah,
and
totally.
That's what I see is happening. And, of course, my life experience, I go back a very long way. And I lived in Marlborough. Now, they had ructions there. They had a Maori murder, war, atrocities there called the Wairau incident.
Yep.
And that was a couple of years after the treaty was signed. So the treaty has really never been honoured, in my book. But living there and growing up there, I can say absolutely hand on heart, Cam, I have never, ever heard anybody speak ill of Maori people in my early life. Absolutely never. And we just lived alongside one another. I've worked with them, right by their side. A lot of Maori people at the freezing works, sharing sheds, everything, and you could not get better people to work with. And they were very honourable and treated me really well, and likewise. And now I come to probably the last 10 years, it's really accelerated.
Yeah.
I'm experiencing racism. I'm hearing people being very rude about Maori people and vice versa. So by trying to tear this treaty to pieces and add principles and all that sort of thing, they've only made matters worse. They've created division and separatism, and even I, from my background, if I'm somewhere and I see, let's say, a couple of Maoris coming along and looking a bit in rough gear, I sort of tense up and, you know, it worries me. Now, I was never like that before.
I mean, you know, I was born in Fiji, and Fiji has had a separatist agenda for quite some time. And it hasn't worked, and it hasn't worked anywhere in the world where they have these types of things. We had terrible atrocities in Rwanda, all on the basis of separatism and race. We've had the situation in Fiji with coup after coup after coup, and you know, I was really hoping that they would have sorted it out with a new constitution, and everyone born in Fiji is classed as a Fijian. But Rambuka's gone back to the E Taukai having primacy. And it really concerns me. And I'm concerned to see that happening in New Zealand as well, where we've had what I reckon is a pretty good race relations situation being exacerbated by foolish politicians who have not drawn up laws that are beneficial to all New Zealanders. And that was the whole idea of the treaty in the first place, that we would all be New Zealanders, that we would all become British subjects. But somehow there's this heroic view now that Maori never ceded sovereignty, but I'm unsure as to how you can become a British subject without ceding sovereignty.
No, well, it's just got an agenda behind it, that's all, Cam. That's the truth of the matter.
They seem to ignore the common sense, ordinary New Zealander, people like yourself and the rest of my buddies.
Yes, exactly. And they're not too scared now to pipe up and say anything. You know, my friends they're all very guarded, what they say, you know, who they're sitting with before they say it and that sort of thing. It's very, very sad, you know, because we actually had enormous respect for the Maori people. And when I think back to people like, is it Prince Tui Teka that got the Pātea
Pātea Maori
together?
Club? Yep.
Look what they did when they weren't victimised. The freezing work shut down. They lost their incomes, and they got together and you know, came up with this absolutely marvellous group that toured around the world. Yep. Lifted everybody's spirits. You know, got off their bums and did something. And you know, so talking about respect, they got respect.
I mean, there's huge respect in New Zealand for the efforts of the Maori Battalion in World War II. You know, fantastic soldiers, feared by the best German soldiers. You know, the Afrika Korps were scared of the Maori Battalion because of their capabilities. So we've got this fantastic culture, amalgam of cultures in New Zealand, and I agree with you. I think over the last 10 years, it's seriously been eroded. And
it's really dreadful. I don't think the politicians live in a glass house, really. I don't think they know how it has affected the mainstream people, because they were like me. They lived without racism. They've come through that. The people in my age group.
Which is exactly why ACT and New Zealand First are gaining support, because they recognise what ordinary New Zealanders are saying. We've had enough of this nonsense. We want to go back to the way it was, where everyone was living in peace and harmony, and Jack was as good as his master. You know, these elitist politicians, and I've actually blamed the Labour Party and the National Party for this, have carried it on with an arrogance that they know best.
Oh, absolutely. It's very, very sad. And like, I just wrote down a little note here, which I'll just say, this is how I see it. Separatism is growing, racism is growing, greed is fueling it. 2040, there's a pot of gold at the end of that. Then what? Because we've got to look at what happens after that. We've got, if the Maori get their... what is it, the he pua thing in. What's going to happen after that? It'll be tribe against tribe. It'll be arguments over equity. It'll be, we want what you've got, but we don't want to work as hard to get it as you did. And then really the next step is violence. And this is only 16 years away.
Which is exactly what the treaty was designed to prevent. The tribes, the iwi in New Zealand signed the treaty willingly because they wanted an end to the tribal warfare. That was the primary driver for iwi to sign the treaty, and people seem to have forgotten their history.
That is exactly right. That's exactly right. And they have, well, I don't know that they've forgotten it. You've got the activists pushing it because they want that pot of gold out of it. But you've also got the media being complicit in it, in fueling ill feeling and fear. Yes. And frankly, it's just fake news. It's absolutely correct to call it fake news. It's made up, a lot of it. And they push a narrative, and they very cleverly groom the public with emotive words and things. They groom them on how they want them to think. And then they can dump a narrative on it and actually have them believe it.
And I agree with you. I agree with you 100%, Lindley. And, you know, for your first call to Cam's Buddies, I think you've done very, very well. And I'm sure that we'll have heaps of comments in the mailbox about just how well you did. And you are so welcome to come back onto Cam's Buddies, and you can do it every week if you want, because I think you are a voice of reason.
Thank you very much.
And I better go to the next caller now, Lindley. So thank you so much for your time.
Okay, Cam. Take care.
You're welcome. You too.
Bye-bye.
Well, that was pretty good, wasn't it, from Lindley there? She volunteered at the end of last year and has been in communication with my producer, and we've got it working. So, you know, I hope she gets lots of feedback coming through. And it's time for me to take the next call. Good afternoon, Paul. Welcome to Cam's Buddies.
Good afternoon, and it's great to be back in 2024.
Well, yeah, I've had a bit of a long break, but back at it now and loving being behind sitting in the host chair and being behind the microphone.
Great.
So tonight's topic is about the Treaty of Waitangi and the so-called principles of the treaty, and David Seymour's attempt to codify what those principles are, because nobody seems to know what they are. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's very sound. And if you were to ask 100 New Zealanders what are the principles of the treaty, I would suggest to you 100 wouldn't know. And I think that David Seymour having sort of boiled it down to 3, being that the New Zealand government has the right to govern all New Zealanders, I think that's a good one. I think that was pretty much written in the treaty. People could see it there. It was pretty obvious that the Maori of the day gave the right to be governed in part of the treaty for protection, actually, from the Crown, from others that were trying to kill them. So they gave the right for the government of the day, or the Crown, to be able to govern them. I thought that was pretty good. And I think another one that he's talked about is honour all New Zealanders' land and property rights. And I think that's another good one. I think if we don't honour the fact that when someone's bought some land, I mean, I know that there's been grievances in the past and there's been land was confiscated and all that sort of thing. And I've even had land taken for roads myself, and they do it in the most interesting way and all that sort of thing. You don't feel good about the process. But the fact that we should be able to be able to, when we've got our land, it's ours and we can do pretty much with it as is reasonable under the law. I think that's another good right. And the fact that we're all equal, it really troubles me when some people have more say than they should over things that I do, and they get put in a place because they're a different nationality or ethnicity to me, so that they now are able to, they get 2 votes, if you like, or they get put into jobs that I apply for that I can't be given that job because my ethnicity is incorrect. I find that very difficult to tolerate. And if Maori have been tolerating that up until now because there's some racist scheme against them, I feel it's a terrible thing. And also, I think we should be judged by our character, or judged by our ability, judged by what we can actually achieve because we've proven we've got some skills, not by what the colour of our skin is or what our heritage might be or where we were born.
What are your thoughts on the claims by people like Rawiri Waititi, by Hone Harawira, by Debbie Packer, that Maori never ceded sovereignty? I mean, I really struggle with this concept because Article 1 of the treaty clearly says, and in the preamble, as Don Brash mentioned earlier in the show, the preamble actually says that we're all going to be one people under the sovereignty of the Crown, and that we'll all become British subjects. And I'm not sure how you can say that you didn't cede sovereignty and aren't a British subject at the same time.
Yeah, I agree with that. My understanding was that there was the Musket Wars happened prior to the treaty, and there was a lot of, I guess, people that felt unsafe, and they were Maori people that felt unsafe, and I think they gave up their rights to govern themselves in behalf of the British government or the Crown to govern them, so that they didn't get killed by other tribes that had muskets. It's my recollection of what was occurring at that time. I wasn't there, of course, but when I've read back in history, I'm reading this and I'm thinking there's a lot of that was seceded. Their sovereignty, they were happy to give it up because it meant that they weren't going to be attacked by other Maori, or if they were, they'd be protected by the Crown.
Yeah, Don Brash pointed out that 20 years after the treaty was signed, there was a meeting at Kohimarama, and the minutes and the written recording of those meetings at Kohimarama were clear that Maori had indeed ceded sovereignty. And indeed, Professor Elizabeth Rata has also said that in 1852, there was a Constitution Act was passed in Parliament that established sovereignty of Britain over New Zealand, and that everybody who lived in New Zealand at that stage was born in New Zealand were British subjects.
Yes. Well, if such things exist, why aren't they taught in our schools, and why is the media going on and on about it's a problem? And they're saying, like they're all talking, like David Seymour's trying to pass a bill into law that says we'll take something from the Maori people of New Zealand. And what he's actually doing when every time I listen to him, and you do have to listen to him to hear it, is he's saying, what are the principles? And these are the ones he recommends. And if those aren't them, let's discuss it and see what they are.
And see what else there is.
No one knows what they are, then it's much more difficult to say, oh, well, we've given the authority to the Waitangi Tribunal, which isn't the highest authority in their land. The government is. So if the government says this is what it is, then this is what it is. They are higher than the Waitangi Tribunal, which they appointed.
Exactly. A caller before you, Lindley, suggested that the problem we've got in this whole debate is a lack of respect on both sides. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that's right. Like when I listen to people drowning out the speakers at Waitangi, regardless of what they're going to say, they just drown them out so that they don't hear what they're going to say. Do folk think out there that by drowning out the opposition so it can't be heard, that it won't proceed? And I'm looking, I'm thinking, if you argue back with a good argument, not with stopping someone from talking, it was like listening to David Seymour. The first half, he was being interrupted a few times, and the latter part of it, they were singing over him so no one could hear what he was saying. What benefit is that? I mean, if I was David Seymour, I wouldn't be going back because there was so little respect for him. And he's Maori himself. I think his tribe is, he said it actually when I was there. I forget the one now, but it was Tainui or something like that is his tribe. And I'm thinking, well, if he's actually a Maori and he's doing this, and then Winston came and talked, and again everyone was arguing him and trying to drown him out, not allowing him to speak. I think they also, when you don't let someone speak, frustration builds up and things happen even more one-sided than if you could actually challenge the arguments with sensible, sound logic.
Well, is the point you make about David Seymour's iwi affiliations is that he's actually Ngāpuhi, which is from there.
Ngāpuhi, that was it. Yes.
So what it was Ngāpuhi being rude to another Ngāpuhi.
Yes.
Yeah, quite astonishing.
And he's allowed an opinion.
Yeah, well, it's funny because It's like they consider David Seymour and Winston Peters and Shane Jones and Nicole McKee as the wrong sort of Maori, that they don't subscribe to their views, so we need to howl them down, we need to shut them up, and our way is the highway. And that is an unacceptable practice in the democracy of New Zealand.
I absolutely agree. And what happens is they're being baited into doing this by the likes of the media. Like I listened to Jack Payne talking to David Seymour, and he was coming from a premise that had no logic. But he was saying one member of a treaty, if a treaty is a contract, if one side of the contract doesn't agree, the other side can't change it. And I'm saying, but if part of the contract said that one side can change it, then it's just part of the contract. We don't need agreement, because if you've ceded sovereignty to the Crown and the Crown says we're doing this now, that's what ceded sovereignty means.
Yep, you cede sovereignty to the Crown. We have a democracy. Politicians create parties. They have policies. We elect the parties we want. A coalition is formed under MMP with the parties that can generate the most number of seats or a majority of the House, and then they set about introducing the legislative agenda. That's how democracy works. You don't like that, we'll get a better argument.
Yes, see, better arguments win, not shouting someone down. And when we're talking about, because they were saying, you know, how big should the fiscal envelope be, and all the grievances that have occurred, how much money should be paid to the folk that have had things taken from them. Well, the real question is whose money should be being paid to such people? And if it's the Crown's done things that are wrong and they're able to make or form redress, great, let's do it. And if it means that no one can afford to move on in the countries all over, well, our family lost a lot of land in China when the revolution happened there. We're not going back there saying, oh, come on, guys, you need to give us, we aren't going to China, so you need to give us all our money and our ships back and our land that we had. It's happened, it's done, we've moved on. Now, the fact that it's coming up in 2040, it's 200 years, lots of these things, the recipients of the benefit of them aren't around, and their grandchildren aren't around. And so what they're saying is, let's make as best redress as we can, and the Waitangi Tribunal has come up with some numbers that they said were good, and how they derived them in the day, I don't know, but they're fairly, they were, the folk that received the money from the tribunal seemed happy enough. Now, where did the money go eventually? Did it have a trickle-down effect, and all those folk that are benefiting under the tribes that have made an agreement, have they received a big gain in life? Well, the fact that 48% of New Zealand young people attend school and 52 don't, I think we're in for a whole lot more of something, because the lack of education will be a much more bitter pill to swallow. And that's like the lack of education, the lack of housing, and the lack of a reasonable health system. These are things that are much tougher than who owns what piece of land so that the few can get rich, rather than everybody gets educated and we can all head in the same direction as equal citizens, having a go and, you know, making it the great country that it is.
You're participating in a vibrant, robust economy that can sustain us all.
Exactly.
All right, thank you for your call, Paul. I appreciate those views, and they, you know, largely echo what Lindley said earlier. So, you know, that's a good first call back for Cam's Buddies from yourself, and I look forward to hearing from you next week.
Okay, take care and bye for now.
Bye. Good afternoon, Jack. Welcome to Cam's Buddies.
Hello, Cam. How are you?
Fantastic. Good. I'm glad to be back behind the microphone, and glad to have you back on Cam's Buddies.
I thought you'd sack me.
No. It's just, this is the first show of the year. You're definitely not sacked. You're a audience favourite. We get heaps of feedback about your wonderful comments.
Whatever.
So, Jack, the topic for tonight is about the Treaty of Waitangi and the so-called treaty principles, and what David Seymour is trying to do with the treaty principles bill, and what your thoughts are on that, and, you know, the annual shenanigans at Waitangi.
Well, the way that it was explained to me when I was a young man by a very knowledgeable person
was his name Noah?
Maori could have been. He was the chief engineer. We young engineers were gathered every morning for a lecture, and he would often talk about Maori. And he said the first thing you guys should know is that Maori are not one race of people. They are several races, but actually, to put it in kind of a simplistic way, there are warmongering Maoris, and then there are the sort of serfs, the ones that are enslaved, raped, pillaged, and then eaten. And what happened was around, I don't know, before 1840, these Maoris saw what was happening, as rough as it was, but the British way of doing things actually had a bit of sense to it. So they approached the governor and they said, hey, we'd like to come under your protection. And that's how it all started. From there, it's grown into something that's just a gravy train. And I'm right behind David Seymour, I can tell you. He's actually nailed it. I think they've had about 4 events over the period there where they've asked or had tribunals to decide what should be given, and a full and final settlement. So we've had 4. I'll stand corrected on this, but I think we've had 4 full and final settlements, which is rather interesting. So that's my thought on it.
What about the claims by various different politicians that Maori never ceded sovereignty?
That's not true. And when they say that there's an agreement or they had an agreement, Britain's never had an agreement with anyone that they've conquered. They conquered New Zealand, to put it bluntly. And they said, yep, you can be one of us, you can be one of our citizens, and you can abide by our laws, and we'll look after you. But they've never had a partnership as such, and they've never had this separatism type approach. So I don't know where that all came from.
Well, I think it started in 1975 when the Waitangi Tribunal was established, and the law said that the tribunal would establish what the principles of the treaty are, and then over the ensuing 40-odd years, the various different judges and vested interests of iwi have created this movable feast of principles that were never intended never intended in the wording of the treaty, which is actually very simple. 3 articles and a bit of a preamble at the start, and somehow we've ended up with this thing where the principles are what the principles are decided on at any given time, and a country can't operate like that. We have to have laws. We have to have rules.
I've never been a Republican, but maybe we should be. Then we could just say to the Maori, all right, we're free of England now. You can go back and talk to them. Your deal was with them, not us.
Well, yeah, exactly. But the
other way would be that we all become Maori, because some wise Maori was asked, what do you have to be a Maori? And he said, you just want to be a Maori. So why don't we all be Maori?
And then the problem goes away.
All of us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting concept. We'll see how that flies.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Jack.
They're not achieving anything for themselves.
No, they're not. They're not achieving anything by shouting down people either. Ideas should be debated. We shouldn't be stifling debate. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is a stifling of debate.
People that ask for respect should first give it. It's a good start.
It's a wise saying there. That's something my grandmother would have said.
I'm probably old enough to be your grandmother, grandfather.
She's not looking too good right now.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear
Jack,
that.
Thank you for your comments, and we'll talk next week.
See you, Cam. Bye.
See you. Bye. Good afternoon. Welcome to Cam's Buddies.
Good afternoon, Cam. How are you this afternoon?
Fantastic, as usual.
Excellent. It's good to be back.
Yeah, we're back. First show back, and the Cam's Buddies. We had a new buddy, Linley, called in, who is from the South Island, and she had some wonderful things to say.
Excellent. I'm pleased to hear that.
Today's topic is the Treaty of Waitangi, the so-called treaty principles, and David Seymour's treaty principles bill. And I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, perhaps I can start by hoping everyone had a good Waitangi Day. I did. I spent it doing my thing in the sun. We were helping to find a wild bull, and it was really good. And I know that a lot of people went to the beach. But to turn to David Seymour, I saw it reported that David Seymour was flashed a penis during the welcome, and I thought to myself, good Lord, this is a welcome of someone of some high office, worthy of respect no matter what, and here we have this kind of what I would call despicable behaviour. And the reality is that I think a lot of Maori and a lot of Maori elders would have been shaking their heads in horror and disbelief at some idiot making a dick of himself.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? You've got one individual who then has basically smeared everybody else participating because of their carry-on.
And I think that, David Seymour has a right to be welcomed on to the marae with some civility, and I think that, the way forward is a logical discussion, and that's one of the reasons why I'm looking forward to hearing more about the treaty principles bill that he's proposing. Certainly, I think back to my schooling, and the treaty has but 3 articles, and it seems to me that there's no principles, and that seems to be a modern Labor construct with legislation they passed in a past government. And I'm kind of bemused at how the principles have ballooned into a massive gravy train.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, really. It's just a single line in a single piece of legislation that mentions the principles of the treaty when there are no principles. And so the courts and the Waitangi Tribunal have taken it upon themselves to write what these principles are, and it seems that they change at the drop of a hat depending on who's got their hand out at the time.
And I think that to do New Zealanders credit, I think the vast majority, whether they be Maori or Pākehā, are sick of a few whingers going to town, and people are beginning to notice the lack of productivity where government departments have hidden their true function and meaning through te reo names. And I'm really bemused at why we can't have a constructive discussion in this country about what has been literally forced on us. And I actually applaud David Seymour and Winston Peters for standing up at Waitangi and laying down the law. And I think that Luxon deserves some credit too. However, I think the people that really are showing their true colours are the media. My goodness, how much longer can the mainstream media go on? And actually, they are the cause of the problem in many cases.
Absolutely. They're fomenting mischief, happy mischief in their regards. They'd like nothing better than to see biffo, buttocks presented, penises presented, yelling, shouting down of various speakers. You mentioned about the welcome of David Seymour onto the marae. Well, it's a Ngāpuhi marae. David Seymour is a member of the Ngāpuhi iwi. So it was Ngāpuhi insulting Ngāpuhi. And clearly the media and those who oppose David Seymour, and indeed Winston Peters and Shane Jones, think they're the wrong sort of Maori.
Yeah. And, all this divisiveness needs to stop. I, for one, am heartily sick of it. And I know that there are many people out there who feel the same way. And, if we can't have a discussion about this and we can't have a constructive debate over what part the treaty plays in our history. Now, I think I have some opinions, but I would really like to hear what David Seymour has got to say in his bill. And knowing Seymour, I think that his bill will be well thought out. I think that his bill will have some controversial aspects, But one of the things I feel very sure about is during the select committee process, I think that we will get the opportunity to make some changes. And this aspect of the legislation or the making of legislation was wholly ignored in the last 6 years by the Labor government. The select committee process was merely a sideshow, and most of the legislation, if not all of it, was rammed through on ideological grounds, with the select committee just being a sham.
Well, it seems that people have forgotten how a democracy works, where we have elections, and then at the end of the election we have, if there's no one party that can form a majority, we, various different parties get together and see if they can work out a coalition and a legislative agenda that they can all agree on. They then create themselves a majority by, joining together, and then they form a government. And then that government then proceeds to initiate their legislative agenda. And it seems that the media and indeed the loser parties have got a very poor habit of assuming that the government is not legitimate, or they do stupid things like when Ardern was the Prime Minister, people would say she's not my Prime Minister, and have these fanciful constructs that deny how our democracy works. I had people talking to me about how if we didn't get rid of Ardern this time or Labor this time, then they'd be there forever. And, I've been around politics for a long time, and I know that generally, in fact, 99.99% of the time, no government lasts past 3 terms. And in New Zealand, we've got a fine heritage of peaceful transition from one government to the next. And people seem to have forgotten that, and they're trying to undermine the democratically elected government of New Zealand with these fanciful claims that somehow they're illegitimate policy and legislative agendas that they're pushing through.
I think the most illuminating and enlightening fact of all of this is that the elites that are feeding at the trough of the Waitangi principles and don't want any change, they are exposing themselves more and more. And the media are unwittingly...
It's not unwittingly, they're deliberately doing it.
Yep, and they're exposing all these... and it's laughable. I think it's getting to the stage where people can see that the emperor has no clothes, and they're actually saying it. They're actually saying it in the streets. And I think David Seymour's bill will have a hell of a lot more support than he possibly imagines. And I think it would be very dangerous of Luxon and National to go against it. And, I mean, in my humble opinion, there's a lot to be gained for clearly defining expectations. And I think David Seymour is to be congratulated for trying to do that.
Well, that's the thing, is what David Seymour is saying is let's have some legislation. Let's have a select committee process. Let's get feedback from the public. Let's then change that legislation in line with the feedback from the public. And let's finally, once and for all, establish what these principles are and set them down in law so that the courts can't tinker with them. And I think that's an admirable goal. Sadly, I think that he won't succeed, and he won't succeed because I think that the National Party is squishy on this, and they keep saying they're not going to support this past the first reading, and that makes me wonder why we're even bothering to have this argument. I mean, I can see some logical conclusions that will come from that, but none of them end nicely.
We want a level playing field. Let's be quite honest. You, me, thousands, indeed most New Zealanders want a level playing field. We don't want one particular group considered above others. We want to have people considered on merit. We want to have help based on the need. we want all this. It's the level playing field effect. Luxon and National would be very foolish to ignore this basic fact about New Zealanders. And if Luxon walks away from supporting the bill, I think his popularity will be tarnished. I think that he needs to man up. I think he needs to look at what David Seymour's saying. I think he actually needs to measure the pulse of the public. He needs to get an idea of what's happening in the room, and he needs to actually put his foot down and say, hey, guys, I stand for a level playing field. You know, we want everyone to be treated equally. And if there are principles of the Treaty of Waitangi that need to be defined, well, these are the definitions that we have come to from public consultation. And if that's the case, I'm happy, you're happy, we're happy. The only people that are not happy are the people who want the definitions to maintain their nebulous current form so that they can extract more cash from the taxpayer.
Well, I think that's what it's all about. It's all about money and power. And Lindley said that, our first caller on Cam's Buddies, Lindley said that it was all about money and power, and there's no respect in the debate at all from either side. And you know what? I tend to agree with her on that.
Yeah, I think that it's a sad day when money and power trumps the democratic right of people to be treated fairly.
Yeah, 100%. All right, Miles, that's enough from you today. we'll talk next week.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cam. It's great to be back, and it's good to welcome all the listeners back after a long break.
Yep. Thanks, Miles. Appreciate your call.
See you. Bye.
See you. Bye. Good afternoon, Jimmy. Welcome to Cam's Buddies.
G'day, Cameron. Welcome back.
Yeah, first show of the year. I've been missing it, and I've been missing your dulcet tones.
Oh, well, it's good to be back. There's a lot happening, mate. What's the topic tonight?
Well, the topic tonight is Treaty of Waitangi, the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and David Seymour's principles of the Treaty of Waitangi bill, and what your thoughts are on that.
Oh, I love it. I think it's clearly a good thing because all the people who politically I disagree with hate it the most, so it must be good. Seriously, all the communists hate it, and it's because they've been using the treaty to advance their communism, and Seymour wants to put an end to it with some principles. I can't see, and if we can't have a debate, then how come we can't talk about the treaty?
Well, we should be able to talk about the treaty. That's the thing. We need to have a debate because there are no principles in the treaty. There's 3 articles and a preamble, and that's it. The principles is some legal construct left as a landmine by an activist government in 1975. And since then, the courts and the Waitangi Tribunal have said about creating principles that were never envisaged by the signing of the treaty or by either party on the treaty. And so I think we do need to have a grown-up discussion around this. We need to air what people think. And then we've got a parliamentary process where they put a bill up. It goes to select committee. You then take public submissions, and then you alter and amend the law to suit and get something that most people are happy with, and you pass that law. That's how democracy works. And it seems that there's a group of people in New Zealand that don't want democracy to work that way. They want to shout down people who have alternate views or differing views, and that's not how democracy works, and they need to be reminded of that.
Look, I completely agree. And the thing is, they keep saying that David's, not consulting Māori.
Well, he is Maori.
Māori do you want us to consult?
He is Maori. He is he talks to himself. He's consulted.
I know, but which Maoris do they want them to consult? The ones they agree with.
Well, here's the thing, right?
My friends are all Māori. No, they're not consulted.
Yeah, but let's look at it, right? 9 of the cabinet, over a third of the cabinet, are Maori. So if the cabinet gets around the cabinet table and has a discussion about the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, then there's 9 participants in that cabinet who are Maori who have been consulted. So you're right. Which Maori? It's almost like they're saying it's the wrong kind of Maori.
Agree with consultants. Yeah, that's the problem. We've talked about this before. They just want the Maoris they agree with consulted, not.
But what is a Maori? I mean, you get Willie Jackson, who makes the most outrageous racist statements.
He's a Jew.
Well, he's more Ashkenazi Jew and more Chinese than he is Maori.
This is just a never-ending circle of New Zealand's doom.
And then you've got Kelvin Davis, who's at Waitangi calling people white spiders, and he's got the brightest, reddest sunburn of anybody at Waitangi on the day. Yeah, it's just ludicrous.
I know. It's just bizarre, and it's just so bizarre. There's such big problems we've got, and we're just fighting over such bizarre stuff like this. So
totally,
I think it's a great thing, mate. I do. And I think Seymour's found something to gain votes over the next term with. And the more Luxon tries to pretend he's not interested in it, he's not going to do it to appease the woke who never vote for him anyway. I just find bizarre.
Well, that was going to ask you the next thing. I can see great profit for David Seymour and New Zealand First in opposing the woke wombles and the racists. And Luxon sitting there trying to be woke as the woke and trying not to appear to be racist is actually alienating him and the National Party from where a large percentage of the population believes and sits where they believe that will be, and that will be with the ACT Party and the New Zealand First Party. And you could see a decline in Nationals' vote and a huge growth in those two parties. And I'd just love to see that. That would just be hilarious to watch.
Well, that's highly likely to happen. I don't really see how that's not going to happen. I mean, most people I know don't want to get rid of the treaty. Like, everyone understands,
the treaty's the treaty, right? It's not going to be changed.
Yeah,
David Seymour's not changing the treaty.
No. And you just can't have an open-ended meaning to it that changes over time. Otherwise, it's just insane for a country. So I think that National is going to have to look at the opinion polls, and I think Luxon will probably make up his mind based on that, as typical with National leaders.
Yeah.
But I think that Seymour was smart enough to get it to the select committee, to get it started, and he just backed his political nous that it would be popular, and that would trap Luxon.
I think he has
played, eh?
Yeah, I think Luxon has been played here, and
he's been totally outsmarted by Winston and David. You can see it, eh?
I don't think he's quite realised that yet, but once he gets the first polls of the year, which will be coming, there'll be one coming out shortly from the Taxpayers Union. It's usually around this time of the beginning of the month. So, it'll be interesting to see what that says. But he'll be getting his own polling as well, and I think he might get a bit of a fright.
Well, I'm sure you'll let us know when you're here, mate.
Oh, absolutely. All right, Jimmy, thank you for your call on the first Cam's Buddies of the year, and we'll talk again next week. Yeah, I'm loving being back, sitting behind the microphone again.
Good work, mate. Thanks, Cam. Cheers.
Okay, mate. See you. My buddies were awesome. How about Lindley? Wasn't she awesome too? I'm so blessed to have such a great bunch of mates and new buddies to share anything with. Tell us who you think was the best of Cam's Buddies and why by emailing inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
RCR is on a mission to revive honest media, and now you too can be an integral part of it by joining the RCR Foundation Members Club. Receive exclusive benefits only available to club members, including your own backstage pass to join the hosts for interactive behind-the-scenes discussions, along with our all-new daily curated news summary, RCR Bites, that's delivered to your email box every morning, keeping you on the pulse of the news that matters in just a few minutes per day. To find out more, visit realitycheck.radio/members to see how you can join the mission that's making a difference.
You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Woohoo, it's time for the mailbag, and this is the first mailbag of the year, and it covers all the correspondence for the last show from December last year and any that have been received while RCR has been on break. Here's a general comment from James. Great show as per usual, Cam, with all it brings to your listeners and the part you have played in giving us a double celebration this Christmas as we celebrate the new coalition and good riddance to the last group of demolishers. Beth comments about my monologue from December 21st. Great monologue, Cam. Wishing you health and happiness for Christmas in 2024. Thank you so much, Beth. Comments now about Casey Costello interview. Anon says, who has prepared her recent briefings? Does she trust them? It's a good point, actually. Another anonymous comment, I can accede to what you said about the government. Guilty until proven innocent is true. I've been a juror for 2 high-profile cases. The Crown charges them with the highest charge possible, and it was up to us to recede or lower the charges based on the defendant's proof. It should be the other way around. Now, my Shane Jones interview, some feedback on that from Linda. Great interview. And then we get on to the Cam's buddies. Vicky says, love you and your buddies, Cam, and looking forward to hearing more from you next year. Merry Christmas and good health to you all. And Claire says, love the crunch, love the buddies. Thanks so much, Cam, for all your efforts. Have a wonderful Christmas and New Year. Now, about my Daniel Newman interview on the 14th of December, an anonymous comment says, on misguided road spending, lower hut raised pedestrian crossings installations, numerous painted crossings upgraded to be raised with bright paint, taking a week of diverted traffic and expense to complete, but not one of them I've seen so far installed at the crossings near schools in 50k zones, i.e. encourage drivers to adhere to the 30k limit around schools, could make sense. All while the Eastern Hutt road zone remains closed to one lane since February 23. I'm curious if these conversions and seemingly inordinate places are present in other districts and or if this is a government or council initiated. Kevin comments on my Gary Moller interview from 16 November. Absolutely loved the conversation with Gary Moller. I have suffered a brain injury from a knock to the head, and while not the same, it has many similarities. Great conversation and hopefully helpful moving forward. And we've got a comment about the interview with Maurice Williamson on the 5th of October. Fantastic interview with Maurice Williamson. Great bloke. Now, some Facebook comments. I had a comment from Glenn. Merry Christmas to you, Cam Slater. I enjoy your show and have noticed you are a considered and compassionate interviewer. I wouldn't have given you the time of day 4 years ago. The polls have shifted for all of us. Heather says, good on you, Cam. We believe we are here to make mistakes and to learn from them, onward and upward. Ian says, well said, Cam. And Jill says, yes, and yes, and yes. Great post. Portua says, wish you all the best, Cam. I'm liking the new you already. Just don't lose that fighting spirit for our freedoms. Don't worry about that. My fight is back. John says, great work. And Judith comments, all the very best to you, Cam. Blessings to all the RCR team. The politicians, apart from New Zealand First, have completely failed in the last 6 years as an opposition. During the COVID years, the only thing they added was to state that they would go harder against the people who do not comply. And that's the mailbag for this week. I look forward to seeing the mailbag next week. Right, that's it for the crunch this week. I've been itching to get cracking for the year, and there it is. It's been a real blast to be back in the host chair, and it's going to be a busy year politically with the new government making inroads on delivering their promises. Plus, of course, there's the big game in world politics, the US elections in November. Plenty to talk about, plenty of people to talk to. Don Brash was ever the gentleman, and I agree with him that we really need this debate on what precisely are the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And Ashley Church provided us with a dispassionate view on the conflict in the Middle East. And you'd do well to read his fact sheet at his website, ashleychurch.com. If you're using the RCR app, you can easily get all our replays as well as listen live. And a big thanks for the team that helps put together the show and make it all work. It's been a real pleasure having you all back again this week and for this year. I'm loving all your feedback. Really enjoy talking to so many people and sharing their thoughts on politics, life, and everything in between. So a big shout out to you all, and thank you for listening and having faith in me as we continue to explore this beautiful game of politics. Hopefully you'll all get to see me riding around on public transport again this year. Not on the inside, of course. You'll never see that, but rather on the back end of a bus. Don't forget email suggestions to inbox@realitycheck.radio for people for me to interview, and let's make this show the best political show in New Zealand. Stay tuned for a breakfast show repeat coming up next that features Money Talks with my mate Farzan Irani and the indomitable and fearless Lindsay Perigo. Looking forward to having you join me again next week for The Crunch with Cam Slater.
You've been listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater. Remember, you can check out the replays for today's show on our website at www.realitycheck.radio/replays. Tune in every Thursday at 4 p.m. for more with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.